And we are live. This is Dark Journalist. Gigi, we had a great start.
We're back.
Everyone, I'm here with Gigi Young. How are you doing?
I'm great. I'm so excited to be here. And yeah, I'm excited for tonight.
Fantastic. I'm joined by the lovely Olivia.
Hi, everybody.
Olivia, you're pretty good in the clutch there.
I lose my patience a lot.
When the stream went down, she started to sort of manhandle the equipment, but that's good. And it's amazing. Tonight is a very special show because we're doing the X Series 82. And this episode, Gigi, is all about Rudolf Steiner's New Jupiter. Now, New Jupiter being where everything is going to in Steiner's cosmology about Earth evolution, and then moving us into what the problem is, what the bottleneck is, and that's Ahriman in the eighth sphere on the other side. So it's literally Rudolf Steiner's New Jupiter versus Ahriman in the eighth sphere, which gets to the core of it. And you and I have covered the Rudolf Steiner material around the eighth sphere to some degree. And I think it's interesting because when I look at your work, I put the pieces together from Steiner's work, and I see a lot of the things that you're bringing forward about portals, for example, go very much with this kind of retrocognitive thing that Steiner was doing, looking back and saying, well, there were Venus men, there were Jupiter men, there were Mars men, and people looking at that and saying, what was he talking about?
Yes, and you see this coming up a little bit, I think, in the New Age and in spirituality, the idea of like Venus beings or Mars beings. And I think there's a bit of a multi-dimensional thing going on where there's times on the Earth that are influenced by certain spheres, and we can see that in the planetary chain. And then there's embodiments of those spheres as people.
Right.
And so we have to sort of think of our conversations tonight very multidimensionally. This is going to be a challenge to kind of really get into that multidimensional state, that playful state where we see things as more than one thing simultaneously, and that's okay. So it's sort of like the Mars beings were a type of individual or being, but there's also a period on the planet that was influenced by Mars, by the etheric body of Mars, and our etheric body was also connected to that. So an interesting merging of planets was taking place that would actually change our appearance a little bit and how we biologically functioned at times, and these would overlap. So you'd have perhaps more Mars beings interacting with more Venusian beings. Maybe from there, the unification of those beings meant something, creation-wise. But Steiner was so advanced for his time. And a lot of the things that he talked about then are so topical for today in spirituality with the starseed movement and everything like that.
It's fascinating. Sometimes when I read Steiner's work, and this has always been the case, I get the impression of someone who was totally able to go forward in time and look at things and give us that wave, because he certainly was able to go back and look at things. And that's the whole Akashic record aspect, where he can go back and look at these different epochs. And it's such a thorough cosmology that I think, the Casey work and Theosophy are probably the only things in that realm that even compare on any level to the completeness of the picture that he painted. And when he's getting into where we're evolving to, New Jupiter, I think this is very important, because very often when we get into whether it's religious fanaticism or if it's the media, and they love to drive this image that we're going over a cliff, that we're on a road to nowhere, that everything's going to blow up, it's apocalypse. You see a lot of this. We were talking before the show about Corona and all that, and the way they love to play this up. New Jupiter is interesting in this sense, which is Steiner ties it in, and we'll get into this, to New Jerusalem in Revelation. And again, Revelation meaning apocalypse. So apocalypse actually is not as bad as it sounds. It's Revelation. It's literally what it means. And when we're looking at what Steiner's talking about, he's giving us New Jupiter this is where we're evolving to, and what needs to happen in this particular period in Steiner's cosmology is that we need to take on this incredible scientific materialism to get past that, to activate this whole chain of events that takes us into new Jupiter, new Venus, new Vulcan as in his system. And what's being prevented, it's almost like imagining the sun being smothered by chemtrail clouds or something. That warmth can't penetrate through and activate this evolutionary chain. So what Steiner is warning about is this Ahrimanic influence, Gigi. We come to it over and over again. And he was looking at the 21st century.
He was. He predicted a lot of this. Like, obviously the language isn't the language that we're using today, but the mechanism is the same. And, you know, we have to overcome the challenges today. We have to overcome our materialistic, consumeristic ways, our obsession with technology to the point that it's fulfilling something that we need to develop. We have to overcome all of that. And the overcoming of that and that very important process of realization is what creates the new Jupiter or the new Earth.
Right.
And yeah,
that's exactly what it is. New Jupiter is new Earth. It's the next version.
Yes.
But that's a good point, because we have arrived at a place where we're more and more stripped away from a kind of spiritual sensibility. And the things that we're fed by the society at large, and of course it's up to us what we take in, but just unconsciously, somebody walking into it, the images they're getting, Gigi, not very enlightening. You'd get the impression that a person, a human being in this era was highly neurotic, and that, you know, he existed or she existed on a very superficial level without knowing anything about depth, and, you know, just going anywhere spiritual or psychic is just like, oh, some woo-woo trip that has nothing to do. It's like a fun ride. It's an interesting overlay that we're kind of riding into, and this is the effect of that scientific materialism that comes up. Where is kind of the opening in this type of world for the deeper information, for example, that we're talking about here?
Well, the opening is in the heart. That's actually the development of the heart tempers the mind from materialism, allowing the emotions to flow, allowing intuition in. One of the first things that happens when we divorce ourselves from the warmth, because the warmth is really sensed in the heart, and then it can go throughout the body, and that's what develops something that's called the higher heart, which goes into something that's called the Venus body. And so we don't want to get farther from that. We want to get closer to that. And so we want to develop that and keep our spirit very close and contemplate it and meditate and take the risks in the direction of our heart. It sounds like a Hallmark card, but it's actually a spiritual technology. It's actually a spiritual process that allows us to be our full selves. It's not a Hallmark card, it's an actual process. It actually develops a different quality of energy in your body that magnetizes you into, you know, the new Jupiter and into the new Earth. And one of the things that helps us remember this is that when we were talking about the show, we were talking about the head and how the head becomes very, very, very big.
Yes.
And that's when, you know, or just it becomes obsessed with the head. The head is everything.
Yes.
And people want to chop their head off, and they think that that's enough to survive, hook it up to a machine. That's because it's not mitigated by the heart anymore. Mm-hmm. And that means it's out of balance. And so we can see that dynamic a lot today. And so we have to build that warmth in the heart is really what's necessary.
Well, you're deep in anthroposophical territory talking about the head there, because Steiner's looking at Ahrimanic influence and saying it targets the head. If you had to look at any organ on the body, that's what it's targeting. And this is fascinating because he described a process where we could imagine that Ahriman basically wants to make off with the head of humanity and have us evolve into new Jupiter as kind of a torso, you know, as a misshapen thing. I think it's kind of fascinating because when Steiner is talking about Ahriman and we'll go a little bit deeper for those who don't know about Ahriman as we get along here. But just for the sake of the fact we've done some shows on Ahriman, that Ahriman influence, it is kind of one of the things that Steiner talks about is that it's a very old influence, and it's an earlier influence than a lot of the other spiritual factors that influence the earth. And I found this age suggestion on his part fascinating. He was talking about how Ahriman is older than Lucifer. So we have a very ancient thing there, but he said it was an irregular evolutionary development that Ahriman has. And I want to show, there's a couple of interesting pictures we're going to show tonight in relation to this. But Gigi, before I do that, Ahrimanic powers being so scientifically obsessed and sort of cutting off humanity from their spiritual knowledge, this Ahrimanic force itself, although wrapped up with earthly evolution, is the result of basically a kind of mutated or retarded development on its own. So this is part of the problem that we're encountering.
It is.
This is an unfulfilled being.
He is. He's unfulfilled, and he's a shadow. He represents the shadow portion of humanity. And he represents, and that's why we have to overcome it, is he is a being that essentially fell a long time ago into density. That's why he's so ancient. But he really represents the densification, becoming denser and denser and denser, and wanting, at least when I psychically tune in, he represents this wanting to know, this wanting to understand and actually get rid of chaos and to know, and to use the mind to know, to use the mind to understand. Right. By refining things and by materializing things and looking at them and saying, okay, I understand that now, and materializing it and saying, okay, I understand that now. So this kind of refinement, this knowing, that's kind of where I see the impulse, this raw impulse coming from. But then it was so early that the energy was like too great. And so it went overboard, this obsession. Now it's the shadow side, or I think Casey would maybe call it more of a night side.
Yes.
Thing, and a night side energy where it represents too much materialization.
Right.
Too much densification, becoming too heavy. And an obsession with it. So it's kind of like a shadow element of a very raw impulse that once maybe had us served humanity and maybe has a light side force, but that's really what we're looking for. And in this way, if we can look at it in this way as that raw, as a shadow side of a raw impulse to know and understand through materialization, then we can see that even moving into new Jupiter, even moving into the new Earth, we can see that even benefits Ahriman by showing him that even though he thinks he knows matter, he doesn't know matter. So even moving into new Jupiter, if we're coming from a compassionate place, even that benefits Ahriman, because it creates a different surge and an opportunity for a different dynamic. So that's sort of my take on that. And then with Lucifer falling later on, perhaps even as a response to this densification, to lift, to despiritualize, and then that going a little bit wonky, going to hedonistic, going to chaotic, but was a response to too much materialization.
Right.
And then we can maybe, this is going quite deep, but then we can even bring in different planetary influences that were involved in the planet at that time, such as Mars or Venus and things like that. We can start bringing in the planetary chain a little bit there. But ultimately, these raw impulses I see as being personified in those two beings. And you can look at them as an impulse, but also as an individual.
Absolutely. Absolutely. For us, it becomes an impulse. And, we have that kind of classic angel on the shoulder, devil on the shoulder imagery. And what we're looking at with Ahriman, it's so interesting that you said heavy, because I always think about Steiner's reactions. First of all, Steiner did something very important by way of the mystery schools. And we know that the mystery schools were letting so much out in that period through anthroposophy, through theosophy, because they figured we needed this as a buffer against the incredible flood of scientific materialism. But he did something very interesting, which is he separated out Luciferic influences from Ahrimanic influences. He wanted to describe what they were individually. And he described Lucifer as Lucifer Gnosis, knowledge, wisdom, that humanity could confront, have boundaries with, and learn. The Ahrimanic setup, the big kind of throwdown against Ahriman, which is set up for this period, is also something where we're supposed to engage Ahriman, and it is technological, and it's going to come on so technologically heavy and so cold in that sense. And we are supposed to confront it and not run from it, basically, but come through that experience. But what he saw and what the mystery schools were warning of is this kind of sleepy daze of going into it, and then Ahriman taking this aspect of humanity and moving it into this irregular chain that he's called the eighth sphere, which at one point he said was the largest mystery. The biggest secret of the mystery schools was the eighth sphere. So we're now moving into territory where the Ahrimanic force is something which is inevitable. And he even said that we're looking at an incarnation of Ahriman, although the way he describes it, I almost think he's talking about the incarnation into almost like a cyborg.
I agree. I know. I completely can see that too. Especially when you start factoring in how some people become obsessed with becoming a cyborg and how dense we already are in 3D. Right. You'd almost have to have an even denser form to house a spirit so dense as Ahriman. It's almost like our organic form would actually be too light to connect it to spirit, to hold something that dense, constantly getting heavier. So you need to make the form heavier. And so and it makes me think of, even like kind of the, Walt Disney and all these people, and they start coming out and they're like, yeah, I'm freezing my head and I want to live forever. And all these very high profile people, like even Epstein, Jeffrey Epstein had dreams of freezing himself. And it's like, who are these people talking to?
Yeah.
Where are you getting your information that y'all are interested in that? So, it's
cryogenic freezing.
Yeah, you want to freeze your brain and you want to hook it up to this computer. It's like, where are you getting your information? So it's very topical, everything it's there.
Well, I think it's interesting when we look, we'll take a little walk down memory lane here with Steiner for a moment. Everyone, I want to remind you, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. We're here with Gigi Young, and this is X Series episode 82. It's Rudolf Steiner's New Jupiter. And we're going to go deep on the influence of Ahriman and the eighth sphere versus what is supposed to be the natural step in our spiritual evolution, which is New Jupiter in the anthroposophical paradigm. And it's interesting when we look at Steiner and anthroposophy, we're looking at a mystery school that came forward publicly. Now, there are a few of these, but most mystery schools, Gigi, as we know, are completely underground and not public, and there's no way to really find out anything about them. The fact that they desired an interface at this period showed how critical the situation was that they were looking forward to. So if you were looking out there in the 1840s, as Steiner describes these mystery schools, looking at the situation that's coming in, they're seeing the potential for these world wars. They're seeing the potential for them apprehending technology through industry, and they're saying they're going to destroy themselves. And with the advent of scientific materialism and these Ahrimanic powers, they're not even going to be recognizable in 100 years. So we need to let them know something that they didn't know before. And so suddenly all these concepts about reincarnation are out there, psychic ability. And we find ourselves being fed things even in the 1860s that seances and all the rest, and the Orphic Circle and this kind of thing. So they're really taking a chance there because they know how powerful that is and how, it has the ability to be kind of a great tool or an incredible detriment. But they take the chance, finally, a small group within those mystery schools moves those mysteries out, and we get Theosophy, and through Theosophy, we get Anthroposophy. When you look at that development and you extend it out to where we are now, it seems like whatever it was that they did gave us the tools to confront this situation in the 21st century.
Absolutely. I think that we, stand on the shoulders of giants in a way with the information that was put out. And you have also, Rudolf Steiner created, he saw probably Common Core and the school system probably eroding, and he came up with Waldorf schools. And you thought, well, if everything's going to become very inorganic and maybe GMOs and, biodynamic gardening comes into play. And even his colleagues, invented certain things that are really serving us today. And so they were working very hard to lay these seeds and foundations that would keep a light on, keep a flicker on in humanity. And a lot of the New Age, I didn't realize this as like a cloud riding New Ager for most of my life. I didn't realize that so much of the influence in the New Age, including the Eastern influences, was actually through the mystery schools. And they just sort of released a bunch of things and then, sat back and you look and you say, okay, what's going to take, what's not going to take, how is it going to get distorted? And of course it did get distorted,
Yeah.
Unfortunately, that's the risk, and why certain secrets don't want to be shared. It's not that there's a desire to keep things to your chest for this maniacal controlling thing necessarily. It's that whenever you share something, it takes on a personality of its own. It takes on an energy of its own. So you talk about a sacred master that's done immense service on this planet. You start talking about that individual and suddenly he develops a double, and, it's very hard to understand that person now because you have to break through this wall of illusion of everybody interacting with that and having their own opinion. And that becomes this threshold in the collective.
Right.
Where you can't actually access the original form of things because everybody trying to understand it has created a distortion. And so you have to be very careful when you have this kind of information, if it's been passed down to you or you remember it within your own being, what you share, because it has to survive the distortion. So it's an immense responsibility. And it, in a sense, I also think it was, planting the seeds for Aquarius and where we're moving into now. Sort of.
It is. Yeah, absolutely. Well, the modern Advent, modern being 18th century forward, 19th century forward, you can see strains of these mysteries, even like Mesmer and those types of movements. You can see the strains of it, but there's no public organization because they're just out of a period where, they were burning witches in the Middle Ages. And so this kind of stuff couldn't really be let out. The timing wasn't there. What I think is interesting about all this now is what they were trying to give us through the mystery schools for this period. Seems to me that Theosophy is the setup, but it is Steiner who reaches in and says, whereas I think a lot of these movements look to the ultimate development of humanity and they say everything's going to be all right because you're going to have this next root race. They're going to be naturally psychic and they're going to want to be more in harmony with spiritual evolution. Unfortunately, they sort of miss this period in between of getting to that next root race. And what happens is, in Steiner's cosmology, there's a real risk of that evolution getting thrown off. And that's when Steiner comes in. And I realized at a certain point when I was reviewing his work that we could be looking at somebody who for 3 decades was trying to spell out one equation, which is that the culture, the leading minds of the culture and the society at hand need to understand what Ahriman and the 8th sphere are.
Yeah.
So that's how I kind of, this is the period that we're in. And so then, Gigi, when we take that information, and we say, okay, we've taken the football from you. We've got it. We understand that Ahriman is a threat through the technology and that they're harvesting those people who suck into that scientific materialism into the eighth sphere. And so basically anthroposophy, spiritual science, offers a buffer against this. But when we look at it, you and I are looking at it and it's 100 years later. This is that opportunity. So now it's a process of reordering the language so that it's understandable in this format and keeping true to the character of it, but having it, sort of have a natural growth.
Yeah, keep talking about it. And I think what people will find is that this is something that I think we know on a very deep level. And I think that Steiner's work and the mystery schools have given us a construct in which to talk about it and to recognize it. But I think this is something that we also know very deep in our being. And it's something that we remember and we sense and that we feel. And so by keeping it alive and discussing it, we'll start to see where it's manifesting around us, and we'll start to wake up and we'll start to become more alert, become more aware.
Right.
And that's what's really important. Once you read the work and once you start to grasp what is being said about the eighth sphere, I mean, it actually makes total sense that, if there's going to be a new earth, there's going to be an artificial step as well. That makes total sense to me. Other, people who do not evolve have to have an opportunity to exist in a different form or continue in their stream of consciousness to play that out. Whatever they're trapped in, they have to play that out. So it actually makes complete sense from a spiritual perspective and evolutionary perspective. So the more that we have the construct, we'll begin seeing it around us and pointing it out. And it's really incredible because it really does provide that overall link, like that overall zoomed out perspective.
Right. It's the panorama of the entire situation. And it's interesting you said trapped there, because that is Steiner's language, which he's saying that the eighth sphere is the result of being trapped in fantasy, which sounds a lot like virtual reality when you get into the 21st century. And that's what is happening so often, whether you see people addicted to video games or getting into things that are very disturbing online, whatever it happens to be, they're locking their thinking and their consciousness in. And they assume basically that they're just, I'm just doing this virtual reality thing, when in fact you're climbing into a different density, a different reality.
You're generating one with your body.
Right.
I mean, that's sort of psychically how I see it, is that every single moment we are manifesting our reality. That may sound like off of The Secret, but I mean, it's true. Every single moment you are actually creating the world around you.
Yes.
And so if you are not engaging with your body, or you're not engaging with your entire being, and you're just kind of in your head fantasizing, you're creating a very specific density around you. You're creating a very specific energy around you that has like a quality that resonates with, the eighth sphere, essentially. So we have to be alert, and we have to watch for distractions. Don't allow yourself to become distracted. Try to train yourself to hold a focus. It sounds crazy, but there's little techniques that we can do to make sure that we don't slip into that dream-like state, that sort of where it's almost like you're half outside of your body, really. And that we don't want to be in that state. You want to be fully in your body and fully alert.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's really a good point, actually, which is, it's fascinating too, because someone who's inclined to be in a meditative state or something might be like, I like being in this alpha state. That's a totally different thing. What you're talking about is a kind of trance, and it's a suggestible trance. And because of the input of that society, you'll be on a kind of a harvesting wheel where you will be, in Steiner's language, squeezed out like a lemon.
Yes, and it's like even as like if we're talking about intuitives working or psychics working, they do enter a trance state, but there is training and precautions that you take to even enter that state, which means you have to have an intention that holds your soul in a certain structure, and there's certain techniques that you use to be in that state, but in a controlled way. It's a working state.
Right.
When if as an intuitive, if I enter a trance state, that's a working state for me. Right. I'm not just sitting there, like that. I'm actually working. It may look like it, but I'm actually doing things. I'm actually working. So if you're going into that state and it's not to actually do psychic work, or you're not doing anything, then someone else can put an intention in there. If you're not setting the intention, that's like an empty chair.
Right.
So it's sort of like
Absolutely.
if you want to go into that state, that's great. You can get a lot of information, and we're designed to be in that state. We're designed to get psychic information. We are. But you have to set the intention. So if you're just flipping into that state with no idea, then you're susceptible to being just sort of in a tug of war with different influences.
Oh my God, what a different quality of life and perception it is. Everyone, we're here with Gigi Young. Amazing work that Gigi does as an intuitive, and her work's available at gigiyoung.com. Your YouTube channel is growing with your series In Plain Sight, which is, I think, very ahead of its time and absolutely fascinating. And you did something very special recently where you just did your first live stream.
I did a live stream and answered everybody's questions, and I had a great time.
Fantastic. It was great. And I mean, a lot of people were very excited for that because, they'll see you do live here, but you doing live Q&A. And speaking of Q&A, we're going to take questions in the second part of the program with Miss Olivia. How's it going out there?
It's going great. Got
Fantastic.
Good questions already.
Excellent. So ask them all in caps, and we'll take them in the second part of the program, and you can ask them now, and Miss Olivia will put them aside, and we'll get to them. What we're going to do is take a little walk, Gigi, through how some of this development happened, and then we're going to go into this planetary influence. But let's start with Theosophy temporarily. So Theosophy gives us early on the mystery schools, and this is Annie Besant and Colonel Olcott doing an actual X ceremony using the X steganography, which is also embedded in the Theosophical logo. It is Olcott who takes Blavatsky on, and he's kind of like the elder statesman out there. He's somebody who worked in Abraham Lincoln's administration, actually, and was on something that was kind of like the Warren Commission for Abraham Lincoln's assassination. When we get to the period where Blavatsky tosses the torch to Besant, who is really politically motivated and will be responsible for the revolutions in India and, self-rule, home rule, and all the stuff that comes out with Gandhi, that's something that she basically constructs him for. We see somebody who has a much more political freedom characteristic to her. So this is not an airy dreamer who's hoping for a better world, but wants to get into like the masters of wisdom. I mean, she's out there and she's revolutionizing countries. She takes on a German apprentice for Germany to lead the Theosophical Society. And this is somebody who is coming out, and he's written some books on things like Goethe, and he has written very powerful scholarly works in Vienna. But he now has outed himself as a theosophist after turning 40, and they're starting to like him. They start to invite him to give talks and lectures. She spots him and says, this is the guy who needs to run the German chapter of Theosophy. So that's the handoff to Steiner and Besant. And there he is very much, he's not the leading man yet. He is still in a setup phase, and it's Besant who is running things after Blavatsky is gone. And so he's basically, kind of giving her the lead and just helping her form Theosophy as it is. And Theosophy is developing more and more Eastern bent that he will become uncomfortable with over the course of the decade or so that he works with it. But that foundation of Besant, Blavatsky to Steiner, I think is important if we're going to understand this, because Theosophy is the actual original breakthrough, and Steiner wanted to go with it as Theosophy. He forms Anthroposophy because Theosophy takes us into a tailspin, because it starts to become distorted by an overly Eastern approach. And we can see a lot of examples of that now when we look around in the alternative field, or if we look around in the New Age part, where there's kind of something of that Eastern character that's almost too attractive. And it's almost like, you know, I'm going to get off this planet and not worry about the things that are here. But that's not really where we're at with this. This is actually a problem that we need to be present for and fix, would you say?
I completely agree with that. I do feel like, you know, the Eastern mysteries are important, and I feel like they line up and provide content and technique for the Western mysteries. And so I think that they flow into one another. I think the trick is the right time.
Yes.
What is the right time? There's a time for Eastern mysteries and there's a time for Western mysteries. And in my opinion, looking into both, the Western mysteries are challenging because they ask you to actualize everything that you've learned in your Eastern studies in every life, right? So they ask you to take that information and actualize it and bring it out into the world. Not just sit on a mountaintop and observe what's going on inside and understand those inner workings, but actually take that and now let's build a society. Now let's take that and see if we can be of service. How can I be of service? How can I take this and make it an action? So the Western mysteries actualize all of the work done in the Eastern side. But what happens is you have to face your shadow a lot when you come in, especially the feminine. And the feminine really has, if you have a lot of feminine energy, or sometimes women, when they come into those, I think the Western mysteries, I think it can be a little bit more of a challenge because it's more of that refining, actualizing. So
absolutely,
that's what I see there. But ultimately, it's you need to go through the Western phase in order to really ground all of that beautiful experience and information that's from the Eastern phase and get it to a point where it's society now.
Right.
It's no longer the individual going inward and evaluating all of their thoughts and all of their emotions and their feelings and learning how to generate certain energies. It's now, how can we create a society that is of a higher quality? That's how I see that. So very different. It's very refined because as soon as you start going out in the world, you can think you know a lot sometimes. And then as soon as you start going out in the world and having conversations, you know, you realize that you're not as spiritual as you think that you are. And that's one of the things. It's like that's the challenge, in my opinion, of the Western mysteries. As soon as you start going out there, you know, and living in the world, you know, you realize that that's that test, and I think that's part of like the Western initiation in a way.
Oh yeah, that's a great way to put it. It's funny too, because I think about Krishnamurti's life and how he came out of Theosophy. Of course, Besant handpicked him out of a beach, you know, and made him into the next Messiah. And he was smart enough to get out at that point because it had become like a cult. And it was going to be a cult of personality, and he was going to be the ultimate guru. And that guru thing spread like crazy. And he would say, you know, it's funny, he's talking in the 60s there, where you have Maharishi and all these other types, or really a lot of imitators of Maharishi. And he's saying, you know, all the people who are disciples that think they're disciples, all they are beggars with a bowl. And I found this really interesting, which is that they were just accepting the light of the guru in that sense. And they weren't there learning the techniques to become individualized. So he looked at them as beggars with a bowl, which is a very different thing. I've come to get something that you're going to give me versus I've come to earn something from somebody who knows a skill that I want to develop.
Yes, and I think that that's something that's a very important dynamic about the Eastern mysteries, is that sense of initiation, and that one person can do it and you have to be around them to absorb it. And I think the Western mysteries have a different dynamic, and they invite you to discover it for yourself. And that's also why it's more difficult, is because suddenly you become that force, at least in my experience. And the other thing that I think is very beautiful is that the Western mysteries are actually much more cosmic.
Yes.
Much, if you really start to get into it, which is something that I did not realize. I was sort of digging in more Eastern texts for a long time to try to find references to cosmic things that I'd experienced, and I'm trying to, understand Sanskrit and stuff like that, and I'm trying to get in there. And then I finally tap into, the Western mysteries, and I find out these are very cosmic mysteries. And so I think that that's underrated. That's an underrated aspect of
It is. Well, the Rosicrucian part is still repressed dramatically. And to such a point that Steiner, when he was putting out anthroposophy, a number of people said, you say it's basically come out of Rosicrucianism. Why not call it Rosicrucianism? And Steiner said, do you realize how many biases there are, and how many challenges there are to calling it Rosicrucian? It's like just actually limits it because of all the different attacks that Rosicrucianism. But he does say that Christian Rosicrucians, who created this new stream somewhere there in the 12th century, in the 13th century, he goes to the East to bring together then the Western and Eastern traditions that separated out sometime around the era of Christ. And a lot of this stuff had to go underground, as we know. One of the things that we learn in the Gurdjieff work is there's two types of information. There's one type is to tell you what to do, and the other one is how to do it. And so the what to do is out there in the open, and in religions, it's love your neighbor, turn the other cheek. But then the actual how to do it has to go underground, because that's persecuted over and over again. Gigi, that information is underground, and it is through these schools that we bring it up.
Yeah, absolutely. And the thing is, I think there's a block there, and I think that the reason why it's underground is because you could actually tell somebody and they will not hear you. And that's this really very strange thing with mystical information and enlightenment and personal discovery, is that you can actually tell someone the exact technique that they need to do to eliminate something in their life, or to dissolve something in their life, or create the change that they want, and they won't do it.
Interesting.
And so there's this very strange dynamic with us human beings, where we have to develop that relationship with the mystery itself. Mm-hmm. And then the mystery speaks to us. And so that's sort of how we have to learn to live, I think, in a way. And by releasing little pieces of information, by leaving things here, it allows that relationship with the mystery to occur. And it allows like a little breadcrumb trail. So we actually don't really even need to be told. We just need to start functioning in a way where we realize that it's all around us. Mm-hmm. And that's, I think, is we're even going into the Eastern Western thing a little bit here. We're realizing it's all around you, not an individual, So it's a different relationship with yourself and with spirit.
No question about it. And there is this idea, I think, very often that in order to function spiritually, you need to be off at a retreat, or you need to be, in a group setting, or you need to be kind of away from your public life. And the truth is that your public life provides the best opportunities to demonstrate that spirituality every day, actually. And it's amazing what you're saying about people who don't want to hear things, because this is so often true. So you actually, it's not so much that the information isn't available, it's that you don't make the application, and therefore, I haven't, progressed in this particular area, and yet all the information is there. Just like this culture, in looking out it's looking for more. It's grasping for more, UFO disclosure, which, by the way, I want as well. But, it's looking for things when, in fact, the track that the mystery schools have laid down, there's so much in it to discover, and it's the application that will bring us this reaction. It's like a cognition reaction. We get excited and we apply something in one of these wisdom teachings, and that activates something.
It changes the quality of our own consciousness, and it changes the quality of the collective consciousness, so that UFO disclosure or whatever it is just happens. We keep banging at the doors of public officials and different companies wanting change, but it's very cliche, but it actually comes with creating a change within our consciousness that then goes and reverberates into the collective. It changes the quality on the planet, so things can't function in covert ways anymore. So that's really what we're looking at, and that's why we have so many distractions going on, is because there's a pressure for people to wake up, so more distractions need to happen so that people don't do that very thing.
Right.
So...
And when somebody is in that cult kind of mentality, like the disclosure thing acts very much like a cult, they're good candidates, Gigi, for the eighth sphere, because they have thrown in to a kind of unreasonable obsession. And it's interesting, too, because I remember getting these emails. I don't know what made me think of this. There was this guy who was sending me all these emails, and he was locked in with a lot of the cult stuff. He was into some of the cult stuff that we've seen around the secret space program. And he was saying to me, I live in Colorado. I am 34 years old. I live in the basement of my parents' place. I have a car and it has 190,000 miles on it, and I have no job. It was this incredible thing. And he's like, all I do is work for disclosure, man. That's what I'm about. That's what we need to change. I don't care if my life has gone to hell. And all I could think when I was reading this is like, disclosure doesn't mean anything to you or your soul growth at that point. Your personal responsibilities, the things that you need to apply in your life, developing your tools for soul expression, that's far more important than some idea that the government's going to give you some idea that they're aliens. So we really have a strange imbalance going on. And those people are great candidates for the eighth sphere, Gigi.
Well, yeah, they're projecting. It's like, well, when I get UFO disclosure, I can finally clean my bedroom. And I can finally, get a new car. But until that happens, I can't. How convenient, It's like we have to be careful that we don't project our own success onto something external, because we can make that mistake, and I see that all the time as well. And the most change in your life will definitely come through doing this. It's very Gurdjieff, obviously, but through doing all of those mundane activities with presence and being with yourself. That's huge spiritual work. It is, in a lot of ways, the spiritual work.
And it's coming out of your comfort zone, because if we look at somebody like Steiner, for example, this is a guy who was on a fast track at 25. He wrote his first book. At 21, he was already in the technical college in Vienna, and he already had access to all these scholars. By the time he was 30, he was handling Friedrich Nietzsche's papers. He wrote a book on him. So the track was laid for him just to be a scholar and to exist in that world as a professor and have everyone accept him as normal. And instead, he steps off that life completely, and he goes into this incredibly difficult task of carrying on the mystery school legacy at the turn of the century. That's the kind of deep dive that it takes to kind of persona. You become a different person. Yeah,
you definitely do. He's like a prodigy, but
it's like we're talking about 5 different people.
Yes, yeah, but we all have the capacity to be that brave.
Yes.
And to take those kinds of risks and to apply ourselves You know, this is something that I think that we can all do. And I think that's, you know, he's demonstrating something that we can also achieve.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's a very unique role, you know,
Yeah.
that he had, but the action of it, the kind of archetype of stepping off of that comfort train and going into something completely.
Yeah. I mean, for a scientist, someone who was writing papers about, you know, philosophy and science and was respected in that community and writing scholarly journals, to just be like, you know, I'm doing a clairvoyant observation now, and going off, and then at the same time, you know, he's in a center. At the same time, he's like, and by the way, don't do visionary clairvoyance because that is not balanced. So he's telling the psychics, you know, come into your center and make sure that you're grounded in your work because you can't spin off and do a different thing. So he's immediately occupying this space where he's like a balancing force.
Yeah.
He's telling science and he's telling mysticism too. Sometimes he doesn't do it, he doesn't focus on it as much, but he does tell mystics, you know, and don't go too far off into this, and you know, so he's balancing it on both ends.
Yes.
You know, coming from this, you know, scholarly scientist pops in there.
So he's taking slings and arrows from both sides.
Right. Yeah.
Absolutely. It's amazing. And when we think of what could have happened there, it's funny when he talks about the first anthroposophical meetings, they're at basically a bar. And the people, when they go there to see him, he said the first group was 9 people, and they had to walk around this huge hole in the floor to get to the back room where he was giving this lecture.
Wow.
Yeah. And I actually found a picture from one of those lectures, which is absolutely fascinating because you don't have many pictures of Steiner lecturing, but there he was. He turns 40, and he's like, I have to go into this sweep, you know, and I'm having that realization, and it's no longer that I can play this kind of, you know, earnest professor genius. And he's going into a whole different thing. And out of that, Gigi, we get eurythmy, biodynamic farming, you know, all of these developments that he does, anthroposophy, spiritual science, and the various Waldorf schools. So, you know, we're really looking at, this is what happens when you take that leap. This is a success story of really going outside of your comfort zone.
Oh, totally. And spirit will work with you at the same time. Like it, you know, people think that they're going to take these risks and things are going to fall apart, but often you'll find that miracles happen, and it will ask you to sort of let go of the material world. You know, stop thinking so much about money, stop thinking so much about image, how you're going to look, how you're going to be perceived. And it asks you to enter this alchemical space, this magical space where you're reborn faster and faster and faster because you're challenged. But that's what makes you able to do more.
Right.
Because you're in this alchemical space where you're letting go of what everybody thinks about you, and you're letting go of how you think that you should be, but it's a magical place to be, and you actually transform faster. Because of that spiritual place.
Absolutely. And it's fascinating when you say that, because I think about that I believe in miracles thing, is that Catherine Kuhlman. And I think about, you know, my mother used to do this stuff where she was really into this faith healer, Catherine Kuhlman, and she had this big line, I believe in miracles. And it was this kind of like mantra that she used. But it is interesting to me because when I look at this aspect of people taking a chance, this is part of it too, because the society that we're building up is really creating a league of conformists on one hand, and then you have all this kind of sort of obsessed cancel culture people on the other. And so it seems to me that it picks its spots, you know, and they also replace genuine causes, for example, and they give you these kind of fluff causes, and they're like, here, go run out and hate this political figure and feel like you're doing something important. So, you know, and I've pointed this out over and over again, it's a great waste of that energy that we need for spiritual evolution to get caught up in these things, you know, even if it's against certain types of figures. we should be able to look at them politically and be like, and that's it. Like we can wrap them up and say that there are political forces behind them. But I think some of the interesting things that we see about like revenge fantasies that pop up in the alternative media in relation to certain political figures, and you'll be like, oh, they're all going to Gitmo and they're all going to get executed. Don't worry about it. And this is a strange thing too, because this is actually setting your spirit back dramatically while you think you're empowering yourself.
Well, you're not in reality.
Right. You're in the sphere.
Yeah, you're not in reality. And we have emotions, and we have, very kind of primal, energy that we can channel to basically create great change, or it can be channeled from us, like as you mentioned, into 2 minutes hate.
Yes.
Then funneled into something like the eighth sphere, funneled into something negative. But we have this energy, this life force that we can use for either. And these things are designed to basically kind of scatter our energy and funnel it off into weird ways. So we don't use it for positivity. So we don't use it to create the change that we need. And we project our issues onto a public figure. And we feel like we're getting this weird sense of justice by tearing them down, like we're doing something good. When really, as long as we're divided, we're not really going anywhere.
Oh, I mean, absolutely. You might even be diffusing the energy against that person.
Totally.
Yeah, it's quite unusual. And I think it's interesting, 2 minutes hate factor, because Orwell is kind of like a mystic when he's writing 1984, and he sees what's going to develop. And we know in 1984, they stand in front of a screen and yell at Goldstein, and the party there that's manipulating them and brainwashing the public gives them Goldstein to hate, so that they keep looking at, oh, I hate Goldstein, he's against me. And then they go back into that kind of mind-controlled space after having their 2 minutes hate. They got it out. It was like, a pressure valve got released. But we see a lot of 2 minutes hate, not only in the mainstream media, but on the alternative side.
Oh, there's so much. Yeah. And, social media really augments that, because you have bots, and you have, people that, you don't know who they are. And so there's that element of illusion too, is you don't even know whether this is the person. Or, so it's like, not only are we being distracted on that level, we don't even know if these are people. So
right.
It's just, we need discernment is really, really huge. And if anybody ever takes any sort of break from social media, and then you go back on again, that it's like you're walking into basically funnels, where as soon as you go on social media, it feels like you're being funneled into different directions with your consciousness. And then you just go to one funnel to another and to another. And so I really encourage people to take some time away and reconnect with your consciousness just on its own.
Yes.
And get that sense back, because, wow, it's distracting.
You're good at doing that too. You know how to dive in and then retreat. I think that's really important. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. We're here with Gigi Young. This is X Series 82. We're looking deep at Steiner's New Jupiter, and we're tripping very heavily into the 21st century as we talk about it, because Gigi, these things become so relevant. It's almost like they've come into full season, like wine. And it's funny what you're saying about social media, because I was thinking, yeah, funnels is a good description, or it's kind of like the cantina scene in Star Wars, sometimes dealing with social media. And it has that like completely bizarro, you don't know where this is coming from. One of the things I want to get into, and I want to mention to everyone out there that you can ask questions in caps, because we're going to take them in the second part of the program. And Olivia's going to put those together. How's it going out there?
It's going great.
Yes.
Would you like a question?
Sure.
Shamanist Anam Kara asked, can we see a picture of Steiner teaching in the bar? Is there one out there? I'd love to see that too.
I do. I found one. I don't have it handy, but I promise you that, yes. And I do want to say that on my Twitter feed for tonight, I put up something which is a series of Steiner planetary seals for each planet, which I think I put up as good homework. So if you go to twitter.com/darkjournalist, it's about the fourth entry down. That's kind of good stuff as we get into this section, which we're going to go heavy on the planetary side, which is a Gigi specialty. And we started late tonight. We had some technical issues, and it was quite interesting the way that worked. But Gigi, it's interesting sometimes when you get around these subjects. There are always people out there who say, well, I had this technical problem and that technical problem, and I'm being blocked and so on. But it is actually true that when you get into deeper esoteric territory, you encounter almost a block that is palpable electronically.
Yes, it is.
You've experienced it. You experienced it in your own live stream the other night.
Right. And it's always interesting. You don't know whether it's because your energy is heightening and it's doing something, or whether I like to call them the gremlins. And they're in the ethers, and they'll kind of swing things one way or another, or kind of like jam things up, and they're completely etheric. There's lots of different things that can go on. It's just important not to be, paranoid or anything that,
Oh, yes.
I think, and
the government has you logged down and it's all.
Yeah, don't go down that road. But I think, and a lot of people who do alternative information, this happens to them. And you can test your streams beforehand several different times. You can turn it on and off. And then when you go to stream, all these problems occur. It's the strangest thing.
It's absolutely fascinating. And I was talking with Professor Peter Dale Scott about this very issue. And this is somebody who's dealt with very, very deep topics like CIA drug running and things like that. And so he was surveilled by these agencies. And one of the things that he told me that I found absolutely fascinating and explains a lot, actually, which is that very often it's not the actual NSA or CIA who's doing the tuning in, but they hire contractors. And those contractors are there to pick up communications. And in many cases, they overplay their hand, even in a way that the agency wouldn't want them to, because they want to go back to them and say, oh, there is something here, and we want to continue doing this job. It's a better payout for them. So they're actually creating these scenarios. But one of the things that he told me, which I find so fascinating, is that he learned that his calls, when they were leaving his house, instead of going to the normal cell tower, were bouncing off a tower from one of these contractor groups. So it was acting like a phone call normally, but instead of bouncing off the normal tower and going off, it was bouncing off their little mini tower, because they had to record all of his interactions. And so that this kind of electronic interference over and over again was the result of the fact that it wasn't going where it was supposed to be going. It was bouncing off into this little side tower. So it is a very real reality, when we're talking about this type of interference. I feel that when I've discussed issues with you, and this has happened to me with Catherine Austin Fitz or certain people that I've interviewed, but with you, it's always again and again, it's CERN. About this kind of activity.
CERN knows, and it's like, not today. They're doing a show.
Exactly.
That's very well. CERN is like synthetic psychic ability.
Yes.
So
that's a great way to put it. Yeah.
Totally. So that makes a lot, and I feel like, if they're making it so they're invincible legally, and they're hiding all that money, they're going to be doing, they're going to have a lot invested in keeping things quiet until they can get it to the point where they don't need to do that anymore.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Well, I thought the good news was they were going to shut down CERN, but no, they're reopening CERN in 2021, and Gigi, it's going to be 5 times as large. And the budget, which was already military grade at $8 billion, is $22 billion. It's quite remarkable for any science project.
That is unbelievable. And I just wonder, as you're saying that, how much bigger is this going to be before people start to be like, this isn't
Yes.
okay?
Yeah.
And I think that there's, it is very Ahrimanic, because what Ahriman wants is he wants people to believe that we don't have a collective consciousness.
Right.
And that we don't have a spirit or a soul. And when you don't acknowledge that part about yourself, then it can be influenced through things like CERN or through lots of different occult things. If you don't believe that you have it, then you're not able to maneuver it and tap into it and control it.
Yes.
It's like you're giving it up, right? And that's, so, and that's what CERN does, in my opinion, as an intuitive. It taps into that collective part of our consciousness. That's what occult rituals do, whether there's an AI electric component or not, is it goes in and taps into our collective consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
And so as long as we don't believe that exists, then it's going to be there to harvest. And so, and the individuals that, run this thing, you could make an argument with their, interest in the occult that they're using it in that way.
It's absolutely. It's like CERN is the epitome of what we've learned about the Orphic Circle in the 19th century, but with incredible technology.
Right. And it's actually crazy to think about, back in the day, if you were an occultist, you were limited if you couldn't develop the occult power, and hopefully that would be a catalyst to heal yourself so that you could hold a higher frequency.
Yes.
Right? So there was a safeguard back in the day before we had all this technology.
Yes.
There was a safeguard if you were a dark occultist that wanted to take advantage of people, that wanted to do all these negative things. You were very limited in what you could do, because your very darkness limited you, and that you can't be a very high capacitor for energy. You're too fractured. And so with the invent of all of this sort of interdimensional technologies, what we're seeing is now that doesn't matter. Now they have potentially more power than they should.
Right.
So it's augmenting something that wouldn't have occurred.
Right.
That's when we make it inorganic, that's what it does. And also it can only tap into lower densities. So.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. It's it's fascinating to me, because if anything, they want to do the same thing that like the kind of Crowley side of Golden Dawn wanted to do, which is they wanted to bring in a being, like we were talking about Lamb, in our last interview, and Lamb has that quality, which is, I'm coming in from this other dimensional doorway. Well, Crowley was doing it through, spells, and he was doing it through this type of thing, grimoire. When you get to CERN, they actually are penetrating into other dimensions using technology. So it's a kind of a direct doorway, but huge dangers with that for a number of reasons.
Yeah, huge dangers. It's just hard to even really apply or fathom, but they shouldn't have that power to begin with. And anytime, even in a ritualistic sense, anytime you do open a portal, it's going to take on the character of the people that are involved.
Mm-hmm.
So wherever it can tunnel to, or the structure that's magnetizing and holding that portal, is like the mind and emotions and the history and the past lives, all of that of these people. And so when you think about that aspect of the occult, that all portals take on and embody the people that do that, and then you magnetize that, you can get a sense of how dark things could become.
Right.
Because their own personalities augmented their own interests. So they're attracting what they are. And do we want that? Do we want portals open? Serious question. Do we want portals open by these types of people who hide from any type of legal action. They've made CERN completely immune.
Right.
Are these people that we want opening portals for us? And what are they anchoring here?
It is. It's certainly beyond prosecution. I mean, there was a period when there were a series of scientists, they were actually from Hawaii, and they wanted to have CERN address the possibility that if they continued down this path, they could create little minuscule black holes. And it was a real tested theory. And the little black holes were called strangelets. And although the chances of them developing it were small, if it did happen, it would be basically a worldwide catastrophe. So they literally decided we're going to sue CERN and go through this whole process. And when they arrived at the point of actually, getting legal action, they were told by a judge, well, CERN is actually a sovereign entity. It's like you're trying to sue the District of Columbia or the Vatican, which is quite remarkable when you think about it. And again, CERN being the agency, it's actually a nuclear agency. And the Hadron Collider being where all this activity that we're talking about is relegated around. So it's that LHC collider inside of CERN that we're doing it, because CERN does, of course, a lot of different things. But it is interesting to me that they are, at least up until they shut down recently to reopen in 2021, the largest user of the internet. That's quite a title in this technological age.
That's insane. But then they trot around like, we are doing all of these experiments and we're discovering all of this stuff. And then meanwhile, they're doing all this dark stuff. We are in an abusive relationship with CERN. And we need to get out. They're lying to us.
We need CERN counseling immediately.
We are though. And, we're really beaten down that we can't, see what's going on there.
No, I agree. I absolutely agree. And what's interesting about it is it plays right into this whole idea of an eighth sphere, because again, we're dealing, just like the mystery schools talked about Atlantis and the two-eye stone and how it was misappropriated, and the types of technologies would overwhelm, and bring down a landmass like Atlantis. Here we are with something with CERN, where just a small group of initiates basically have access to it. And they're initiates in that strange kind of tech death cult. Yes. And so they don't have the kind of ethical radar in order to be able to bring this forward. So I do find it fascinating how this fits in so much with the things that the mystery schools are warning about. Yeah, you had something?
This is a great question. PJ Dillard, if the left side path people are now free to clearly manifest themselves, i.e. CERN, etc., why aren't the right path schools now coming out into the open? In my opinion, it's now or never.
It's not interesting. I mean, I know that, the right-hand path schools are basically helping the culture along all the time. And they have an ethical function which doesn't allow them to come out and say, I'm a greater, we're a greater group than you are and we're going to lead you. What they do is they give tools and the society picks it up. And so there's always been traditions of the masters of wisdom, hidden masters and things like that. I don't want it to be like a superstition when we think about right-hand, left-hand schools. When Steiner was talking in his era about America and what Blavatsky was dealing with, when she went and tried to get admitted into the mystery schools in America, they were all controlling the political parties. So we can imagine 100, 150 years later, that situation is probably much worse. And that's where you get a lot of the secret society abuse. So, it's something that is factual in that sense. And then this idea that I don't want to have us think of it in a comic book form that there are these master superheroes out there that could swoop in any day and fix all our problems. It's not that. It's that there's a tradition that goes all the way back, Gigi, to the Egyptian mysteries. and beyond. And they've been trying to kind of hold that knowledge and preserve it for humanity through various disasters, the most recent one being, for example, World War II, where so many places and so many people were bombed out of existence.
I think that what we see with this question, I'm not an expert on this by any means, but I think that what we see with this question is what we're really seeing is a different ethical standard between left hand and right hand practitioners or groups, a different ethical standard. One side says might is right, and I'm going to do whatever I want, and I'm going to harvest your energy, and it proliferates more and more and more, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the other side is respecting people's free will, and they end up functioning, as you can imagine, extremely different. It's not mom and dad are fighting. It's one views you as a sovereign entity and wants you to experience it and dances a line of, it's like a parent, with the higher beings that feed the higher societies, is they want you to experience enough contrast so that you can not have to experience this again. Right. And I think there's a difference between that consciousness and dancing that line, and people who just want to come in and just take everything they can from you. And I think that's what more or less what we see as just it's a different dimension of functioning.
Yes.
It's a totally different dimension of functioning between the two. One wants you to one day be on your own without them, rise you up to their level, and the other one wants to just devour you till there's nothing left. And so we can't really, even though they're both into the occult and mysticism, you can't really compare them, I would say. So
yeah, absolutely. This is a good point, because subjugation is the goal on the left-hand side. They want to subjugate people who don't have the wisdom that they have. On the, like the Western initiators are trying to move the culture to a place where it can naturally spiritually evolve. Great question, though, I have to say, because it really, sometimes you do wonder when you're thinking about the schools. I always think it's good to put them in practical terms. I'm going to make this point. Krishnamurti, who we've described earlier, Krishnamurti, who came out of the Theosophical Society, addressed the UN in 1985. That is a direct handoff of the mystery schools working directly into the political system to try to get them to change, to give them some aspects. And that is that culture inside the UN acknowledging the mystery school influence publicly to a certain degree. And the funny thing is, the UN got progressively worse with the things that they do. But there was this period where, under the leadership of people like Dag Hammarskjöld, who built a gigantic meditation room in the UN, it is interesting that these people are there. But when we think about it, when we think about people like Besant, as I mentioned, and her influence over Gandhi, and we think about Krishnamurti in the UN, these mystery aspects, it's important for us to zoom in on it because they already play that role in our lives. We're just discovering them. We're not attributing to them anything. There are so many qualities that they have that they're already so active in our society. So for good and for not so good. You were talking about portals earlier, and we were talking about Jack Parsons and the portals that he was attempting to open up with Crowley's help. And then we get really out of control things like the UFO waves of the late 40s. I mean, these things, like CERN, have a delicate balance, and we need that mystery knowledge to kind of help us. So, Gigi, how do we get the leadership, in a sense, to a point where they kind of have to acknowledge to us, okay, we know, and we know, okay, let's get together and reconfigure this?
Well, we have to just keep talking about it and keep having conversations and try on a very grassroots level right now to have the right conversations and challenge ourselves to not just trust everything that we see in media, and really look for when we're being entrained or when we're being tricked by things, really become skeptical of what's around us. But honestly, I do feel that we are going to many people are probably going to have to go through some challenging times in order to catalyze this type of awakening. You know, I would prefer not to say that, but I do feel like there are some people that will have to go through some more difficult situations in order to be catalyzed. Some people will be guided to certain information, but we have to start making that connection with our spirit, really, at the end of the day, and investing in it, trying to say, I think my spirit is saying this, I think it's telling me to read this or go here, and just start investing in that, taking the risk, like we were just saying, take that risk in the direction of where you think you should be, and challenge yourself, get out of your comfort zone, basically. And also support people who are doing good work, support this show, support people who are telling the truth and who are risking a lot to tell the truth. Support those people, share their information. And there are, and this is the thing that always baffles me about the situation that we're in, is that there are people who are incredibly talented in politics right now that have the ability to lead and have had that ability for 10 years already. You know, there's great journalists, you know, there's great people, but they're not able to rise because their material is not getting viewed, it's not getting shared, or they're not getting that attention. And I think another aspect of it is we have to watch when things are feeding our shadow. So are we watching something? Are we engaging with something for a release, kind of like a 5 seconds hate?
Yes.
Because a lot of the time we watch stuff for like this weird cathartic release, which is fine once in a while, but it does take our energy. So why are we watching things? Are we watching things to indulge our shadow, or are we doing something to build our light? And usually if we're building our light, if we're building our warmth, it's challenging us a little bit.
Yes.
And so look for that challenge, look for that little bit of uncomfortableness, and find grace in that space. And then you'll be building a different quality of energy that will pull you and pull the world into a higher place.
Fascinating, absolutely. And well, Gigi, your work is so interesting to me because being familiar with the mysteries, you coming in independently, though, you're in the tradition of the mystery school teachings. This is the interesting thing about your work, which you've arrived at independently. I mean, now you're threading maybe some of the combinations of your work with the mystery school legacy. But it is interesting to me, that's something that you come right down the middle with. That is something that where, you know, you kind of speak the same language.
Yeah, I really truly came from the New Age, and the New Age has a lot of traps. The New Age has a lot of traps in some Luciferian elements, and I think if you can, you know, I kind of made my way through the New Age, and I found that there's a very nice balance in a lot of the mystery teachings because they've been here forever.
Right.
And when we talk about, you know, someone like a Steiner or Casey or a Blavatsky or, you know, Krishnamurti or these, you know, teachers, they're teaching things that were in existence before them. And so there's this great balance, I think, in the fact that you can do a lot on your own, but there's something extremely beautiful and ceremonial in a way in coming back to the mystical history of this planet and being initiated into that as a human being, the traditions that have been carried on. And one of the things that I found coming back into my memories and is that it's all really cosmic. It's all really just history and our journey through the stars, and it's really so nature-based in a way. It's hard to describe, but there's
We're
nothing
finding out
really
more about ourselves.
Yeah.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. Oh, it's amazing. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist show. We're here with Gigi Young, and this is X Series 82. We're going into New Jupiter, which is a concept brought forward by the Austrian mystic Rudolf Steiner, who created spiritual science, anthroposophy, out of the ashes of Theosophy, in a sense, which he had spent many years associated with, over a decade, and I think wanted to uphold a kind of true Theosophy. I don't think he was, he actually understood Theosophy as having initiates at its cradle, which I always thought was a good phrase. But Gigi, we're going to do this thing with Steiner. We're going to go back to front a little bit. So what I want to ask you to do is, if you have this is the last now recorded quotes of Rudolf Steiner that he wrote out before his death in 1925. If you have that handy,
I handy.
I would like you to read that.
Okay, so I want with cosmic spirit to enthuse each human being that a flame they may become, and fiery will unfold their essence of their being. The other ones they strive to take from cosmic waters, what will extinguish flames and pour paralysis into all inner being. Oh joy, when human being's flame is blazing, even when at rest. Oh bitter pain, when the human thing is put in bonds when it wants to stir.
Wow, unbelievable. Those are the last written words of Rudolf Steiner. Gigi, there's a lot in just that little section.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it sort of encompasses his journey, seeing this dynamic, seeing people as a flame and wanting to keep that flame and that warmth going, and seeing that be a cosmic flame that needs to keep going. And then also at the same time, seeing the other ones and that want to take from the cosmic waters and extinguish the flames and make them paralysis, make them paralyzed, unable to function. So
paralysis, Gigi, he's talking about a kind of spiritual paralysis where they can't move because they don't know which way to move. The fire thing is interesting there also, because it ties in with something else that we were talking about, which was the great burning of the Goetheanum, which became the center that Steiner had developed for anthroposophy. A quite remarkable building, which they did rebuild, and it is remarkable now in Dornach, Switzerland. But the original was even more unusual somehow. And Steiner's legacy, in a sense, the Goetheanum became a focal point for all this. And it was burned down by the Nazis in 1923. But interestingly enough, or it was actually New Year's Eve, 1922. Interestingly enough, there were a few things that survived in that fire. The fire was pretty massive, but you and I were looking at something that survived that Steiner had built. And he had kept this separate from the Goetheanum. And he had referred to it as deep heat, or a place of deep heat. And in fact, there was a furnace there. But we know with Steiner, he's always working on two levels. We'll take a quick look at it, and then let's talk about this. This is this very unusual structure. And earlier, Olivia, you were pointing out that kind of looks almost like an animal here.
It
like
does.
Chairs. Yeah. But this is what survived out of the ashes of the original Goetheanum, which I'm going to show now. So we'll just refer to that as deep heat. And then this was the original building that Steiner had developed, which has a kind of Jupiterian, is that a word? Jupiterian
Sure.
look to it. But this was the center this was the stronghold. This is what Steiner had invested his life and blood into. And it was, in fact, burned down very shortly after it was created. And, of course, this is the updated version of the Goetheanum, which still stands today, a beautiful building to go and visit. Gigi, when we're looking at this and we see Steiner's creation, and then we see this deep heat building, you actually got impressions from deep heat. What were they?
Yeah, I got lots of impressions. Well, to me, the chimney actually seemed like it was an exhaust, so that it was releasing the warmth that we're talking about. It's releasing the heat, releasing the warmth into humanity. And so I also got a sense that there was a connection underground to this building. It looks unassuming, as unassuming as something that Steiner could create, but it looks, rather unassuming. And that there were connections underground, and that energy was generated and pushed up out of the chimney to contribute actual warmth into the world. And the deep heat, I think, it's talking about spiritual heat too, not just like heat. And I also got, I don't know if this is just symbolic, but a kaleidoscope images. And also the materials were important for it. But there also is like an underground connection where the energy may actually be generated that goes through the through the thing. But it's a spiritual generator. That's what I would say.
Yeah, spiritual generator. For them, the Nazis in this case, who saw Steiner as competition, especially, this is before their major rise. This is more the era of the putsch, where they try to overthrow the government of Bavaria and take power, but it doesn't succeed. And in fact, Hitler gets sent to prison over this. But it's kind of like, the Swiss chalet prison where he's able to write Mein Kampf. It's interesting, though, because they see him emerging and they see, oh, we want to use the occult for a totally different reason. And we know that they'll use even theosophical concepts of superiority of races and things like that, which was a misuse of the original work that Blavatsky did. When they burn this down, Gigi, this is a showdown, in a sense, between this Ahrimanic eighth sphere side versus the Steiner work on New Jupiter. It seems to me that clash is contained right in that arson.
Oh, absolutely. I think that is what was going on. And it was being built, and it was going to generate a lot of energy, And I do feel like it actually, I feel like he was rebuilding something from another time.
Right.
And so, I think from their perspective, they needed to squash any competition, but they also didn't want that type of energy being grounded and emitted that would compete with their own, so.
Fascinating. And this, a year later, also, not on New Year's Eve, but on New Year's Day, will take aim at Steiner himself, where he'll be poisoned at one of these anthroposophical events for New Year's. And then it'll be a slow decline there for a couple of months. And he will die. He won't publicize this fact that he's poisoned. It's well recorded in letters to his wife. And in the 18-year-old anthroposophist who was there and accompanied him to his doctor, and when she came up to him, because he'd waved her over, and she said, he whispered in my ear, "I've been poisoned. Take me to the doctor." And they whisked him out of there. But Gigi, it's fascinating because there's a couple of things I want to ask you here. The ritualistic idea of burning the Goetheanum on New Year's Eve the year previous, and then of attacking Steiner with poison on New Year's Day. How do you see the timing ritualistically?
I mean, that is an incredible, it's almost like saying no more new beginnings. And Yeah, one after another is obviously a huge blow.
No doubt about it.
I mean,
Yeah, the timing is just extraordinary, leading off the year with these things. Yes, Miss Olivia.
I have to read this.
Yeah.
Okay. So Sun Riches says, my medicine teacher went to the Goetheanum one time, long after Steiner had passed, was eating at a picnic table with another person. A man approached and asked for the apple on the table. The person sitting with my teacher was stunned. When the man left, she said, that was Rudolf Steiner.
Wow.
Mhm.
I love that it was an apple.
Makes me want to cry.
Is he really gone?
That's a fascinating story. I have to tell you, the amount of people who've written to me over the years and have said to me, you know, I work with aliens, or I'm a spiritual teacher, or whatever it happens to be. The amount of times that Steiner shows up in their dream.
Mm-hmm.
One guy told me that Steiner showed up in his dream, and he didn't even know who Steiner was. He had to go out and find the books.
Yeah, I mean, that was my whole thing. I mean, that was my awakening, is him coming to me and memories coming forward. And yeah, so that was my thing too. I mean, I just don't go on the internet and talk about anything, you know, so it was impactful for me, and it changed me in a lot of ways. And so, yeah, he comes around, he'll come around.
Oh, it's powerful, and it's personal with you. I have no doubt that there's that echo of his work rippling through your own work as well. You know, because you have such an ease with the material. I want to show a couple of things here. This is the Goetheanum burnt down. This is the actual newspaper article of how the Nazis burnt it, and you can see it was burned right to the ground. Interestingly enough, let's see if I can get that. Gigi, that's the deep heat. It's unscathed. No problem.
It survives.
Deep heat comes back, and now it's still there. But I do feel that when we're looking at that, it's odd, because there they took that out, but they left deep heat.
They didn't mean to.
Yeah. Right. They missed the most important thing. A couple of interesting things, since we're talking about Steiner and the Goetheanum. Now, the Goetheanum set up basically with this kind of idea of the forces that are besetting humanity and humanity's leap forward into new Jupiter. So the incredible statue of Ahriman, which in its various developments has 6 fingers and has that kind of long shape of the head and the pointed face. Steiner, when he was sculpting it, said that he felt at a certain point, as he was tuning into Ahriman to do this and bring it forward, that he was becoming heavy, like he was getting drenched in granite and cement. Heaviness, Gigi, we started off with a little bit of that. These energies are very heavy. They're very materialistically drawn. It is a slow and kind of inhuman feeling.
Oh, yeah. And I think, when he said paralysis,
right?
When you get to that place, it's like you're so heavy that you can't move. I think that part of it is it really works with our fear.
Yes.
Keeping us in fear, because that actually slows down our energy, and shock and panic, and that kind of lower emotional spectrum. That's what really kind of makes us very heavy. And so that's why maintaining that on the planet is so important sometimes. It doesn't allow us to lighten and get that lift off.
He once described Ahriman as the epitome of fear.
Yeah.
So it is a paralyzing fear. I found it interesting, which we touched on, which was that when he was talking about how old this force was and how it's an astral force that takes a physical form, I wanted to follow up on that, actually, and read a couple of things about New Jupiter in relation to this, and remind everyone you're watching the Dark Journalist show. We're here in X Series 82. We're going to be taking your questions here in about 10 minutes with Miss Olivia, who's at the ready. And this is going to be good because we've gone into the different areas, but now I want to get Gigi into the planetary side and get your take on this. A few quotes directly from Steiner. And this one is in the Apocalypse book, which is his lectures in the Book of Revelation. It's a fascinating series of lectures. Let's start with this. New Jupiter will be quite differently formed. It will be a new earth, soil, air, water, and every being will be different. It will be impossible for beings who have only gained the earth consciousness to live a normal life. In fact, they will become backward beings. But now comes something that will comfort us. Even on this Jupiter, there is still a last possibility for them, through the strong powers which the more advanced will have to move those fallen beings, to turn back, and even to convert a number. Only with the Venus incarnation will come the last decision, the unalterable decision. When we reflect upon all this, the thought we recently considered will be seen in a new light. It will no longer call forth anxiety and disquietude, but only the determination, I will do everything necessary to fulfill the Earth mission. I'm going to explain a couple of things that he's referencing there, but let me keep rolling. The condition of mankind will then be such that those who have reached the goal of evolution will have entirely permeated their astral body with Christ. They will be ready to pass over to Jupiter. Upon our Earth, they have made the plan of the Jupiter evolution. This is the plan which is called the New Jerusalem. Gigi, New Jerusalem, in the Apocalypse, we have this whole ascension aspect where the 144,000 are chosen. It's interesting to consider when Edgar Cayce did his deep readings on the Revelation and the 144,000, he called them the sleeping spiritual cells inside of a human being. We're getting multiple levels of things because on one hand, we're talking about a planet and we're talking about the elect, the 144,000 chosen. But in fact, when we drill it all down, we're talking about consciousness and spiritual cells, and it goes far beyond anything that we could take physically.
Wow. And isn't that just what we do in this era of materializing everything? We take something spiritual and we say, oh, it's special people. It's like 144,000 people that, you may or may not be part of that group. Fear, and so, but really when you look at it as something like cells that maybe create a bridge to Jupiter, create a bridge to that new Earth, that's something that everybody can achieve, So
Absolutely.
It's so much healthier and more truthful.
No doubt about it. It's fascinating too. I want to bring this part out because as I read Steiner's work and he's talking about these various things, like when he refers to Venus humanity and Jupiter humanity, and a lot of people don't know what he's talking about there, but one of the great things that you've been able to do is talk about portals and how they worked, especially in that era, and how there would be the descent into Earth from a particular planetary body, a consciousness. And the one that you pointed out was Venus.
Yeah. Oh, yes. Is this in regards to the Lucifer influence falling, or?
Well, that's interesting too. Absolutely. And it does. But what I was getting at really is the idea that when we're looking at planetary bodies and how early humanity worked. And so when Steiner's going back there, they're thinking, what is he talking about, Jupiter men or Venus women or whatever it happens to be? Was he saying that there were physical human beings who came here somehow? And what you described as portals was very interesting to me, because that idea that these groups could come and basically import themselves. And back in that period, because of our pliability physically, they could embody through a portal. They could come through, and then you'd be dealing with a number of Venusians, or you'd be dealing with these soul groups that had developed a certain type of body, and here they were becoming physical on Earth.
Yes, which is so incredible to think about, how the density would be different from today, to consider that, but also that those would be the foundations for where we are today. Our body is a mix of these things. But yes, there are portals that are to very specific planets and star systems that were opened. And they allow different incarnations to happen. Usually, yes, and they have to stay open in order for certain beings to come through. And in order for certain influences to stay on the planet. If you have an harmonic influence and, you want that lightning influence of, say, a Venus portal. Venus is usually also stabilized, in my experience, by the Pleiades, stepping down communicative energy from there too. So there's different sort of dimensions of it. Yeah, and also one of the things that happens esoterically is that there's a battle for these different portals, and wanting to sort of close them down or plug them off, destroy them, or shift their power to another location. So the portals are actually a very big deal. So.
Well, it's interesting too, because we find ourselves. Well, you had something of a mystical experience around these portals, which I always felt was interesting, which was that the people who came through the Venusian portals had one aspect, which is they seemed to be chased, or they seemed to be run off, or they seemed to be persecuted. And their favorite mode of escape was water.
Yeah. So there were times on the planet where certain influences would overlap. So I found that a lot of the times when something would come in, it was to be of assistance to an era that was falling. So for example, if there was a Mars era on the planet, and the planet was sinking very deeply into war and into conflict and into the shadow side of masculinity, you'd have a Venus portal open up, and that would come in and that would heal and that would enlighten and try to balance out that polarity. And that's perhaps where a lot of the references come from about Mars and Venus,
Yes.
And so but not all of the people will see the new portal that's opened to influence and to heal and ultimately to help as good. They might see those people as being different and bad and evil, and they may be persecuted, right? And so that's when I've popped into different memories, and when I've looked back in the Akashic, that's some of the things that I see is beings wanting to come and help, from Venus and the Venusian level, and surprisingly not being accepted in, and divisions in the population happening around people that want to stay in old beliefs that do not serve them and that are not cosmically correct. And this is the other thing about when it comes into rituals and esoterica is you have to acknowledge the present time and the present position and power of the cosmos. And all initiations mirror the cosmos, whether it be a memory or right now, or a time in the past or now. You have to acknowledge our time that we're in. And so there's certain groups that think that we're in a different cosmic time because they're damaged. And that's also the difference between light and dark magic, is the darker occult often thinks that we're in a different cosmic era. That the sun is different, that the sun is something else, and they often are trapped in this past era. So maybe a Mars faction's trapped in this past era where the cosmos is totally different. Some people wake up with a new influence of teachers coming in and are able to be present, but there's this stunted aspect of society that sometimes doesn't move on. That is, I don't know if this is making sense.
Oh, absolutely. You know, it's fascinating too, because in the sense of Mars, they're trying to recapture the dominance that Mars had in that portion.
Yeah.
And they're using the kind of old map to get them back into that position of power.
The old techniques, the militarism, and we can see this immense obsession with going back to Mars and you know anchoring through the moon and going to Mars. This is the regressive planetary chain. This is the regressive chain. It's not the progressive chain. What we're talking about tonight is the authentic cosmic evolution, which is moving into Jupiter through new Venus and Vulcan. That is the progressive chain.
Right.
That is where we are being led to as we lighten. And the regressive chain is going back into, you know, Mars and through the moon to Mars, the shadow side of the moon, the unhealed portion of the moon, into Mars, and you know, so through Saturn, through the density vacuum. And that's in my opinion, that's what Ahriman is in charge of, and that's the matrix that he sort of runs. It's the unhealed parts of these past eras that we couldn't be in the present moment. And yes, I don't want to go too deeply.
No question. Yeah, fantastic. You know, what's amazing about that, you always hit it on these things at an interesting point, the way that you come in on it. But what's fascinating is when we think about the position that we're in, moving into new Jupiter, according to anthroposophy, the eighth sphere sits over the Earth. And we come in looking at it, developing, getting stronger. The stronger that the eighth sphere develops, the more difficult this natural progression is. So when the mystery schools come forward through Steiner and they're saying the eighth sphere is a problem, Ahriman's a problem, and the message that they're giving us is your evolution is at stake. And when we see things like, you know, the reinvigoration of nuclear weapons after they had been, even in the 1980s, everyone had decided this is too crazy. And now we're seeing those things opened up. When we hear about space as a war-fighting domain, we can see that, you know, in the 1930s, people were pretty relaxed with the lives that they had or whatever. And little by little, you know, Hitler marched into the Rhine, and little by little, they militarized themselves and they developed an air force outside of treaties. And before you knew it, we were in World War II, and there was hell to pay for not paying attention to those signs. As a matter of fact, John F. Kennedy wrote a book called Why England Slept, which was all about this period of why did they go to sleep when this stuff was happening? That's the same kind of feeling that I'm getting as we're looking around at the different ways that the society is manipulated, and that the stakes are higher because of the technology that's in play.
Oh, exactly. The technology is so influential. It's a game changer. But these are old patterns that are reverberating, and old techniques. You know, we know, you know, Mars, Aries, God of War. You know, this is deep in our subconscious, but it's also, they were also very real times on the planet.
Right.
And so it's in our cosmic memory. It is. It's there. I always found it interesting when you look at the planetary chain that it says, you know, new Venus and like new Jupiter, because it's suggesting that it's not laid out for us, we're creating it.
Right.
And even Venus is growing and changing, and Venus is not the same as it was linearly thousands and thousands of years ago. It's also evolving too. And so there's this beautiful, I think, evolutionary sense that is in the little details of new Jupiter, like new Venus.
Amazing. Absolutely. That's incredible. It's a great way to put it. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. We're here with Gigi Young going deep on Rudolf Steiner's New Jupiter versus Ahriman, the Eighth Sphere. It's very clear cut, the two different visions for humanity in the future. And that's macrocosm and microcosm. Microcosm, you can see it playing out in the political processes in this year, 2020. Everybody's going to be pulling you to one side, and everybody's going to be in this kind of haze of run for president and all the things that come with it. But in fact, the real challenge for 2020 is getting a handle on some of the deeper aspects that are happening here with this. Now, one thing that you and I have touched on, which I think is one of the most fascinating areas, and we're going to do this, and then we're going to go to questions with Miss Olivia shortly here, which she's got some good ones.
I have tons.
What we have is the Mercury-Venus switch. I think this puts some real meat on the bones of what you're talking about with portals, because I've thought about this over and over again, and there's no reason for them to have switched Mercury with Venus from the mystery schools, as Steiner said that they did. Now, I'm going to give some real point blank quotes on this, because I don't think that people understand, who even study anthroposophy, the impact of what he was saying there. Because what he's actually saying is that the mystery schools reach in at a certain point and they are concealing, as it were, the identities of Mercury. They're switching identities with Mercury and Venus. And what's fascinating about that is that when you're talking about portals and, these are the two closest planets to the Earth, then the idea that they would switch them, it would be, Gigi, well, without me saying it, why would they switch them? What would the mystery schools be attempting to do by changing that in astronomy in the Middle Ages?
Well, I mean, they would stop people from being able to tap into those influences. They would be blocking them essentially by making a faulty, you wouldn't be able to create the portal properly because you wouldn't be using the correct sphere.
Right.
You wouldn't be able to hold the right energy in your body to create the proper tunnel. So you would just tunnel somewhere else. You
can't figure it out. You just have to abandon your plans for.
Or you'd create like a weird alternate 8 sphere-ish reality that isn't going to where you think it is, but you would create something else, like some kind of tulpa or whatever, some kind of tulpa.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Would you say that I would be, if I were doing this, obscuring my path so that someone else couldn't find it?
Oh yeah. Oh, for sure. Absolutely. You would be making it, you would be protecting it. So that maybe something could come through, something could come in. You want it, or you wanted to make it so that it would stay pure.
Right.
Like a snapshot.
Absolutely. I'm going to read a couple of passages of Steiner talking exactly about this, which leave no question as to the precise nature of what he's talking about. And it is fascinating. One of the things he says, so we know how this works. This is from a lecture, June 11th, 1912. And he's talking about it, and he says, employing, therefore, in this case, not the old terminology, which was altered by Kepler. Now, this is very interesting because Johannes Kepler, being kind of the father of astronomy, he's pointing directly to him as the agent of changing this, as altered by Kepler. So that's kind of fascinating. This is another quote. This is from Microcosm and Microcosm, 1961 is when it finally got translated in America. Referring to the application of the many facts, I'm going to start this again. The moon revolves around the Earth, and the planets, usually called Mercury and Venus, are nearer to the sun and revolve around it. I emphasize here that in the course of time, a change has taken place in the names of these two planets. The planet that is called Mercury today was formerly Venus, and the planet called Venus today was formerly called Mercury. Therefore, you should think of these designations reversed so that they do not correspond with current astronomical designations. The planet lying near the sun must be known as Venus, and the planet lying farther away from the sun must be known as Mercury. So it's clear as a bell that this is what he's outlining. But again, he says these things, and he says, the reason for this can't really be given. So the mystery schools aren't ready there, Gigi. But it is a very strange thing to me, because when we think about all the different systems and all the different things that they rely on, Mercury and Venus must have enough in common, being close to each other, that they felt that they could do this kind of esoteric trick, but also keep things on the general level where we'd understand generally astronomically what they were all about.
Yeah, I mean, it's incredible. I think that Mercury and Venus are connected. I think they channel through one another.
Yeah.
So I think the energy is very similar, like Mercury coming through Venus, I would say. And so I think that you could switch it there. And I mean, if people were going to be using it in a negative way, their psychic senses are probably not nuanced enough to honestly be able to tell the difference. It actually takes an incredible amount of psychic power to read the current energies, because there's so much going on. So a lot of the darker arts would rely on grimoires and things that were channeled in the past or whatever. So they're probably just doing things in the old way so they could switch it, and they, people wouldn't really notice unless they were able to tune in. And then if you are able to tune in to tell the difference, you're not going to use it in that way. So
Right. Absolutely. And Gigi, from a kind of a psychic standpoint, what are we looking at with spheres in the first place?
Oh, wow. Well, spheres are completely multidimensional. So you can kind of look at them as personified, as what we were saying, as having a specific type of archetypal being. On Venus, so much time on Venus is about the emotional body and the development of intuition and working with water, and just very, very distinct arts that are very unique to Venus. And then, when you start getting into Mars, it's totally different. The personification and the environment is totally different. And then and then if you take that and you start overlapping it with the Earth and merging that, you get something different as well. But they are an archetypal force, and we can see those forces in our astrological charts or in the studies of astrology. We can kind of see like what the planets represent. And then, but there's also, like you said earlier, there's sort of personifications. So they're really kind of multidimensional.
Absolutely. Yeah. And when somebody who is psychically sensitive is dealing with that, they are not looking at a planet the same way that I would look at a planet, for example, or an average person would look at a planet. And, we know science, the way that they look at a planet, hey, it might have an ocean in it, the minerals. The way that Steiner's talking about is there are legions of spiritual beings that come through these different.
Yeah. You have to place the planet or the star system within your energy. So you take the planet or the star system and you start to kind of merge with it a little bit. And what will happen is that whatever it may be weird at first, but whatever connections you have with that system on this planet or others will start coming forward. And so they're not so much something to contemplate in their material sense. You're actually going to miss it. They're not meant to be seen that way.
Right.
They're meant to be communicated with as points of memory, as points of discovery, and the story of humanity exists within the planets and within the stars, and their arrival, their coming, their going, and even spiritual initiation, whether you be doing so in a group or just on your own, mirrors the pathways that were already forged in the stars. And so by connecting with them, and this is why, you look at some people's funny hats, like Egyptians' funny hats and things like that. I mean, they're trying to remind themselves and remind us about these star patterns that let us know our history. And we all have a relationship with our history. You have a way that you were in that time. Mm-hmm. You have a journey that you were on. And so when you start connecting with these things in that way, you start unraveling parts of yourself. And so that's why cosmic consciousness is so important, is that it allows, or a relationship with the spheres, if you will, is that it allows us to have this deeper vision, which is exactly what Ahriman doesn't want. It wants everything to be, short, right? Mm-hmm. But when we start communicating with the spheres ourselves, we start activating ourselves, basically. That's what I would say.
Activation. Absolutely. Wow. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. It's deep, deep, deep in the planetary spheres. And my feeling, though, is that now we're starting to get a sense of it on this level that Steiner's looking out at it. Because, it's interesting. In the Casey tradition, he sees the soul departing from Earth after death and going through an incarnation on Venus, in a Venus body, not in a physical normal body, but in an etheric Venus body, and then moving through these different realms and coming back. That's very interesting. I remember, just as an aside, one of the stranger experiences he had when they were doing these readings on Saturn. And he said, I had this experience. It was like a dream experience during the reading, which he often had dreams during the reading. And he was walking around on the ring of Saturn, and he realized that there were guards on it. And he said, oh, Saturn's a maximum security prison.
Wow.
So that gives us some idea. But technically in the readings, it said where all insufficient matter is cast for remolding. Sounds like a purgatory.
Well, this is the thing that I psychically saw too, before I knew that Casey had really said that, is I saw a chain, like a vacuum, a vacuum chain that gets denser and denser and denser and denser and denser to Saturn. And so the vacuum chain was basically made up of through the moon. So the moon contains a lot of the pain and stuff in humanity. It's sort of like a snapshot in a way through that portal, and then it would go to Mars, and then it would go to Saturn, and then it was also connected with Orion a little bit. And so it was like this densification pathway that included all of our kind of like shadow past, basically. Kind of all of our pain that we couldn't deal with is what the section was. It was strange, but it's very similar to very similar vision to that.
Wow, incredible. With that, Miss Olivia, I'm ready for your questions.
Okay. There's so many great ones. I'm not going to be able to get to all of them. Okay, Bethany Green says, I'm very positive about the future. Isn't it important to be informed, but knowing truth will prevail and the New Jerusalem will arrive right on time? By being in the flow, we can be present and useful.
Yeah, you have to, it's so important to have the higher vision. And to take that higher vision and bring it into your heart and to bring it into your soul and to turn that higher vision of Jupiter into an actual sensation of your being, an actual personality that you have. So you want to take that higher vision that we have and not just have it as an abstract idea and then go to sleep on it. We want to actually take that and be like, how would I act in the new Earth, in the new Jupiter? How would I act today to that? So we want to make this a working idea within us. And so there's a difference between having this be a working concept that is bettering us and that is actually aligning us with that. We're aligning with it, right? So we want to align with that by embodying that.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's a difference between just saying, there's a real issue sometimes with people being like, well, I'm just going to be fine. I know what's coming. But we really want to pay as much attention to the nuance as possible because we don't want to ignore opportunities for growth and opportunities to essentially make very deep changes in society by just saying, oh, it's already happening, it's already done. We want to bring our attention to the minute details and create a new Earth and a better society. We don't want to bring any crap with us.
Mm-hmm.
And we want to get to that point of refinement by holding the vision and the feeling and the sensation of what that higher world may be like. I hope that makes sense.
Fantastic. Sylvia.
Okay. Mount Cleverest. New Jupiter and New Atlantis. Is this the same dynamic?
Oh, I love that.
Gigi.
I like that. I would say that the New Atlantis would be a foundational culture that would lead to New Jupiter. If we can get that, if as a society, if we can really understand what Atlantis represented to us, the vision for that, that would then generate enough energy to create the dynamics for.
Absolutely. And what's interesting, Steiner has these patterns playing out over and over again, where he says that New Jupiter now is going to mirror the first Lemurian epoch on Earth, where we weren't so closely knit in physical matter. And so, although I don't know if he said this, I would assume the next phase out of Lemuria in New Jupiter is into the Atlantean epoch again. He has this, and he often talks about how the post-Atlantean epochs now that we're in mirror back to those Atlantean epochs. And so, we're going through the same thing. It's like almost mirroring through these patterns. But then I was thinking about it and thinking, okay, we're going to go through these different stages of evolution on Earth, and it's going to resemble the Atlantean period again. We're going to go around the sun on that. And we're kind of reinvesting and rediscovering Atlantis now because we have the same types of firepower, the same types of technology that they had in that period. But when you extrapolate that out into the New Jupiter aspect, you realize, oh my God, this whole thing is playing out from the point where, Atlantis was a certain high development out of all these other processes. And it got distorted. But this mirroring, Gigi, it's kind of fascinating because he's basically telling us you're going to go all the way back to Lemuria, but in New Jupiter, which is New Earth after all.
This is the thing about our consciousness is that the same Lemuria is both a phase of development of the human being, and it's also an impulse that repeats.
Right.
As a generative force, an experiential force that we a common denominator that we move through in order to see how we're progressing. It's the feminine aspect, and then we move into it, and then that becomes refined into something like Atlantis. It's more of the masculine aspect that takes that everything, all the kind of chaotic beauty that comes out of the feminine gets refined into something usable and shareable in the masculine aspect. And so there's this dance back and forth that exists in every sphere. It's the in and out breath. It's the expansion and contraction of life. And now, like you're saying, we did take a spiral downward, We did have a fall from Atlantis. And so we're experiencing Atlantis. It's not like we're saying we are in Atlantis again. It's that we're experiencing Atlantis in a lower density. So we're even still working with crystals, you know, with all of our technology and stuff. It's just in a much denser form. So we're experiencing the same dynamics, but in a lower density, basically. That's how I see it.
Absolutely.
And then I guess Jupiter would be the higher density again, but with resolution, from a place of resolution and refinement, higher. So,
well, it's two quick things grab me on this. One of them is, seems like there's this rounded round aspect to it, that phrase of development always carries certain keys, and that's why it's mirrored, because it contains a kind of a formula for development. And what's interesting, I mean, it's actually bizarre. There was I crisscrossed Steiner and Casey's work quite a bit, but there's a work reading with Edgar Casey where he's talking about World War II, and he says, well, this, as we find, is the same cycle that comes around every 1600 years through the influence of Mars. And he said, if you go back to 340 AD, you'll find on this very continent a large-scale war taking place as a result of this influence. Literally, every 1600 years that influence comes around, and war is the result, was the implication. And I remember thinking to myself, wow, you know, it almost seems like there's a pattern playing out. You can almost imagine somebody thinking how futile it is for me to try to resist anything that's going on, because these forces are in play and they're repeating, and we're in a kind of eternal recurrence of the whole thing.
There is that element, but I mean, the influence of Mars does not have to be that. It can be a time of actually refining and making sense of the feminine era, the feminine era that it followed. I mean, the problem with the Venusian era is Luciferianism and hedonism and complete chaos, and that's what that's what happens in that era. And a Martian energy, or an energy of the masculine, a more masculine sphere, would really sober that, and would really allow the good to be taken from that and to create a new foundation. And then the feminine comes in again, brings that creativity back, brings that wild energy back, opens everything up again, and then it's refined again. So it's actually a very beautiful process, but how we relate to the masculine and feminine spheres is based on our take from it.
Right.
So.
Right, absolutely. Miss Olivia.
Okay, so I'm going to just ask a couple questions together about the new Jupiter.
Okay.
So Laura Lloyd says, does new Jupiter manifest after the Gospel of St. John, or is it manifesting now? And Dash Rendar wants to know, is the new Jupiter related to the end of the Kali Yuga, which is coming in 2025, according to some?
Oh, that's pretty interesting. I'll tell you this much I know about new Jupiter, which is it's conceptual and spiritual-based reality on one hand. There's an actual physical development that will come out of that, which will see us move into an actual physical aspect. What they're talking about in New Jerusalem, and what Steiner's referring to with New Jupiter, is, first of all, a spiritual happening. And this is the thing, actually, I have to go to Gigi about this, because Gigi, again, there's a trick of the mind here, which is we would think, oh, Earth will crumble down and then physically we'll jump to another physical planet, and then that'll have physical things, and there'll be a sun, and people will figure out how to get water and industry going there. But this is a psychic, spiritual development, actually, which has a higher nutational rate than, say, physical Earth nutational rate. It is a different kind of a thing. When you get on that level, you're interacting with a different kind of matter almost.
Yeah, it's almost like an enmeshing with it. And I think that we have so much, coming out of a Kali Yuga, as they were saying, we have such a reaction. Even the fall of Atlantis is deep, and even the fall of Mu is like deep in our being. And so we have this like twitch reaction where whenever we talk about something new, we think that we have to go through this incredible pain and trauma to get there. And we really don't. We really, really, really don't. We just have to find balance. The only times that things turn into cataclysms and a lot of bad stuff goes down is when we're not in balance and when we're not in harmony. Personal harmony and then collective harmony. Only when we're out of that balance, which exists in our hearts, only when we're not there do these cataclysms happen as a reflection of our own inner being not being balanced. So we control how things unfold based on where we are mentally and emotionally.
Fascinating. In Steiner's work, the way we think controls the weather. Casey's work, sunspots were the result of disagreements on Earth.
Like large-scale disagreements?
Yeah, and
That's so funny.
What's weird about that is you think about the Tower of Babel, and sunspots disrupt communications, and you get a large enough sun disruption and you'll knock out all the communications on Earth. So it is very interesting to think about the traditional story of the Tower of Babel, which is they're building this tower that can reach to heaven, and the higher beings looking at them say something very strange. They say, oh, they're going to know things that we know. We're going to have to confound their language and bring them down and make them all speak a different language. This is where we get that very unusual mythology that ties in. Miss Olivia.
Channeling the heart, Barbara Joyce.
Yes.
Does Ahriman do battle on each planet against the qualities that each planet represents? What is his relationship with other planets?
Barbara Joyce always asks good questions.
I love this question. What an intelligent question. What an expansive, intelligent question. In what I have seen, Ahriman's force is really visible now because we are so dense. And that's really where he likes to be, is in the very, very, very dense worlds where you can harvest energy. But because Ahriman is so old, when you feel into his energy, or at least when I have, he does go back, but his influence isn't as strong because we're not as dense.
Right.
So it's like, I see him as still being around with his plans, but he wasn't, he wasn't he has his sort of maximum power now, but he was definitely around as a challenging force.
No question.
I would say.
He's instrumental in the destruction of Atlantis. He's a key figure moving through the Belial group.
Oh, yes.
But it is interesting what you bring up there, because Ahriman in Steiner's mythology, remember that Ahriman, the term, comes from Persian mythology. So this is another key that Steiner is giving us by using that term. Theosophy didn't use that term when they spoke about these things. Other mystery traditions don't. Steiner does. And we know in the traditional story about Ahura Mazda battling Ahriman that he has to simultaneously stab him in the head and in the lower abdomen just to keep him at bay. He keeps going. Then we find other traditions that he's actually Ahura Mazda's twin. So there's a major key in what Steiner is bringing us into the Persian Zoroastrian tradition of Ahriman. That's definitely an interesting twist. And oddly enough, he said it was important when he studied Goethe and Goethe's Faust, which was, Faust is this incredibly mystical play that Goethe wrote. He said you have to understand that Mephistopheles in Faust is Ahriman, and that the Luciferian, the idea of what we have as the devil, is Ahriman, and that it's a mix. Again, it's almost like this Mercury-Venus switch with the Lucifer part. He splits off Lucifer, Gnosis, and Ahriman into two different ways. So he equates Mephistopheles with Ahriman. So very, very interesting name work there. Yes, Miss Olivia.
Okay, well, actually, I'm going to just ask this straight out. What's in our sky wants to know. I'm confused. Could DJ explain again the difference between Satan, Lucifer, and Ahriman? Which one is the devil?
Ahriman is what the Bible and religious traditions know as the devil. The Lucifer Gnosis is contained, wrapped up with Ahriman. They both got merged together. But in the anthroposophical universe, Ahriman is the main evil figure, and that the Lucifer Gnosis has performed differently in the past. In one sense, it's founded part of the Eastern mysteries, for example, and there was an actual incarnation of Lucifer that changed creation, and that was in 3000 BC. Now, there had to be, in order for evolution on Earth to continue, 3 incarnations. The incarnation of Lucifer, the incarnation of Christ, and then finally this incarnation of Ahriman. This is the laying it out. And it's interesting because the phrase there about Ahriman's incarnation, this is a book, Lucifer and Ahriman, which is just one quick lecture or two that he gave on the subject. It's a very small book and a quick read to scare you late at night. But one quick thing that he says in there, and I think this kind of gets to the answer to the question. A being like Ahriman, who will incarnate in the West in time to come, prepares for this incarnation in advance. With a view to his incarnation on the Earth, Ahriman guides certain forces in evolution in such a way that they may be of the greatest possible advantage to him. And evil would result were men to live on in a state of drowsy unawareness, unable to recognize certain phenomena in life as preparation for Ahriman's incarnation in the flesh. Gigi, that line, the transhumanism, a state of drowsy unawareness for men to live on, while Ahriman is preparing, they're unable to recognize certain phenomena in life as preparation for Ahriman's incarnation in flesh.
It's chilling. It's chilling because it's so important. And people don't really know the difference between that progression of, Lucifer, Christ, and then this very dense siphoning force that is Ahriman. They each have a different role in society, and there's a lot of confusion around it. And yet there's this very important incarnation coming, this very literalization of this force into form. So it's interesting that there's that there is confusion around it. But yes, I think that the very dense form of an android or something that's even denser than a human is the perfect.
Yeah, that is where it's going. Absolutely.
And then you see people pushing for it.
Sorry, I thought Sophia Robot immediately.
Shoot, go for it. Your favorite, Sophia Robot.
Julian wants to know if Ahriman is the Antichrist and the great beast of Revelation.
Yes.
Yeah, simply. Okay.
It is. And remembering that the Antichrist idea is just opposition to what Steiner calls the mystery of Golgotha. So this is, the overcoming of physical bonds through the crucifixion and all the rest. This is the esoteric, liberation that takes place. So the Antichrist as a notion, the Antichrist is the opposite. It's putting humanity back in those chains. So at the end of his life, Steiner says there are those forces that want to paralyze that creative inspiration in humanity. That's what he's talking about. So it doesn't have to be a person necessarily. It's a force, the Antichrist. But Ahriman is an actual incarnation of an individual, just like Lucifer and Christ was an actual incarnation. What do you think of this term, Antichrist, Gigi?
I think that was explained beautiful if Christ's incarnation. And I always love how, for anyone watching that does go cosmic with it, I love that how Steiner explains it as the literal incarnation of the sun.
Yes.
Because this aligns us immediately with the correct cosmology.
Right.
Like
right.
what we were saying before, that the problem is that people get caught up in those previous stages. And
right.
so the thing about the Western mysteries is that right in the center of it, you have the correct cosmology in the center. So that's something that's magical. So if he is giving us the etheric codes to ascend out of this realm, because that's the force that he is the sun incarnate. That's giving us the etheric codes to leave here and not be trapped. Then if that's the Antichrist, if Ahriman is the Antichrist, this force is the Antichrist, that means that he's trying to give everybody the codes and to basically make them denser.
Yes.
Heavier.
Yeah, absolutely. And that is the whole eighth sphere thing. And you can see the lore of it, because it seems like, oh, I'm just, you're getting into that realm. And when somebody is deep into an addiction, it seems like they're going places, like they're evolving towards something that's good, and it's, and there's all different levels of addiction, but certainly drugs are a good explanation of that. And when you think about that, Gigi, it seems like, it reminds me of the biblical term, or there's a way that seems right, but the end is destruction. So it's like there's a part of us which is easy, we're kind of malleable because we are in the process of developing spiritually. So the idea that this thing would, increase our sense pleasure in that sense would seem like you're moving towards development.
Yes, and if we are in a state of paralysis and numbness and overwhelmment and desperation, the sense pleasures can seem like they're much higher than they are.
Yes.
And this is, where the dark occult really starts to spin off, is that they just keep, chasing that, and they think that that's all that there is. And we have to know that there's so much more to sense with and to sense from than just our lower 3 chakras or our lower 2 chakras. And just the physical senses is of small, and actually all physical senses are increased and magnified by the development of the higher bodies. And you can actually use all of the lower chakras with much more precision when these are activated. And so not only is it being trapped in sense pleasures, but you become like really clumsy, and you lose that refinement that we have right now. We have a beautiful energy body right now.
Mm-hmm.
We don't want to lose that and become denser, because we probably would have to have an entirely new energy body if you merge with machines. People need to know this. You don't have an organic system anymore, so you're going to have a totally different energy body. And that's why it's the Antichrist, is because you're no longer even working in that form anymore. So
this is why I bring up the transhumanism so often, and it amazes me because I know that they must have been exposed to mystery school information at some point, but the transhumanists, or even Elon Musk, when he talks about transporting his consciousness into a cube, I mean, the mystery school tradition is the endocrine system of the human body is how you contain the consciousness. You can't transport your consciousness into a cube.
Yes, and I had a thought about this the other day. For my In Plain Sight series, I get into
Yes.
secretions and things like that.
Yes.
And I just started looking at Hitler's Lebensborn completely different recently.
Oh yeah.
Because what if there are forces that know about the secretions and the glandular system, but rather than have their own, they just want to steal them from other people?
Yes.
And that could be something about, I know that's going way, way, way out there.
No, absolutely. It's absolutely an interesting question because there is a Steiner lecture actually that deals with occult groups that sacrifice animals. And for those who are sensitive to animals, I'm not going to go deep on this one, but the point is that they know that they can utilize the same types of things that you're talking about from an animal to achieve a certain type of occult result. And we've seen that in these types of groups. They like, animal mutilations and things like that. What's fascinating, though, about what you're saying is to develop an entire program around harvesting that.
Yes, that's
from
what
human
I was.
beings. Yeah.
And we were doing a show a little while ago where I was like, we're talking about Lebensborn, and I was like, there's something about the Atlantean endocrine system, wanting that, and I was thinking it was, because some technologies don't work unless you can spin it properly, and you have to have the right endocrine system for that. Then I was like, well, this also could be very connected with putting your head into a machine and thinking that you can literally harvest people that have the correct endocrine system and breed people with the correct endocrine system so that you can live in your machine land.
Yes.
So these are things that, you look back and we're talking about the Nazis, burning down the Goetheanum, and we're talking about the dark occult, but what if what we're looking at today with all of the transhumanism is an extension of that Nazi program? And what if that's what we're seeing? Because to me, I see the energy signature as the exact same. So
absolutely. Oh, it's a fascinating. Miss Olivia.
A cult fan. Can actual new creatures come through portals? And what is an actual scenario Gigi can imagine?
A new creature?
A new creature come through.
A new creature. Well, I have heard of things, becoming extinct as the planet changes energy. So as the planet goes through these little different layers and changes, animals can go extinct. And it's not necessarily because of human influence, hunting down all those dodo birds and things like that. Animals do become extinct because the energy on the planet no longer serves them.
Oh, yeah.
And I think that also new creatures can be discovered and can come in as the planet shifts energy. New flowers, new species can form to represent the new energy of the planet. As for John Dee style, or maybe not John Dee, but as for summoning things, anything that you summon, if you're thinking about some kind of strange creature, there's always going to be some basis in you and the planet. There's always going to be some that has to be anchored in something. So even if it looks like a weird creature, it's not complete in its weirdness, in that it's always referencing the planet, so the archetypal realm of the planet that we're on, and then whatever you have within you. So even though it may be weird compared to other things, it's still referencing that system. There has to be something to join it that is similar. Hope that's making sense.
Yeah, absolutely. What it makes me think of, and I want to ask you, I've never asked you about this actually, which is, it made me think of the Mothman.
Mothman, yes. Yes.
He's a parallel dimension jumper.
Exactly. Okay.
That's a human form taken on as a bird, but so many witnesses, you can't deny it. I mean, and the red eyes and everything. So he looked like a bird, and he was tall, but he had a human body and deep red eyes. And you've got sheriffs, and you've got people who've told the story generationally from when they were 16 to now when they're in their 70s. So the advent of the Mothman, is kind of an example of that. This is one of those types of creatures that might come through that. What do you think of the Mothman?
Yeah, I think that it was real, and I think it happened. He appeared on a bridge,
Yes.
and he was like intimidating or like warning people or something.
Yes.
I think somebody did some summoning somewhere.
Yeah.
Pulled that thing out of some dimension, and I think that when the moon is full, or when the veil is a certain way, or when the whatever concoction it was created under comes back around, whatever stellar alignment and energy that it was summoned and comes back around, it can reappear. There are dark things that can come through. There are light things that can come through.
Mm-hmm.
That's how powerful we are.
Yes, absolutely. Fascinating. Miss Olivia.
Okay, so Najat Madri, was Steiner a psychic medium or was he an extraterrestrial being? Maybe Vulcan? Guy said that Steiner was a clairaudient and that he heard discarnates. Is that true?
Well, he had some experiences with discarnates even when he was very young. He saw a woman who would disappear into an oven. And it turned out that she was a relative who had died 10 years earlier that he hadn't met. So he had this ability when he was very young. He's a very unusual child, and as we can imagine. And when we think about him, he seems like a number of people in one. So he's a very unusual soul that we had the ability to have with us to do this, and a very unusual mission. But I wouldn't call him a traditional medium. He's visiting spiritual realms.
I would say that Steiner was immersive. So I would say that he used all of his abilities equally. And that's what I've always perceived. And you have to it's, the fact that he was I'm always amazed when there's like a Steiner or Casey, like the males, because it's a lot more challenging to learn those ropes, I think.
Oh, yeah.
But when they get in that space, a lot of male intuitives, when they do get in that space, it's incredible. The specifics that can come in, and that's the difference, is how grounded the information can be, how much sense it makes to the logical mind.
Absolutely.
So that was, I think, his gift intuitively, was to take these very high concepts and be able to make them something that people could understand, because sometimes it's difficult to step down information all the way and have it not be very poetic or very nebulous sounding. Like, really getting it exact is risky. It's incredibly, the more exact you get something as a psychic, the more risk you take.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I think that's, and I do agree that he has associations with Vulcan, 100%. And I think that's why that ability was there. But, because that's a very specific filter, but yeah.
That's interesting. Actually, I think the Vulcan part explains a lot when you think about it. This book, An Outline of Occult Science, is really the one that I recommend. I mean, Knowledge of Higher Worlds is the one if you want to personally work on yourself, but if you want to know about the spiritual realms that he went into, this is an interesting thing that he says in this book, which is very brave considering it was written in 1909. And he says, the book is written based on direct spiritual perception. That's interesting, Gigi. And the way that he talks about discovering information reminds me very much of the process that you use, because he talks about, I mean, this is a guy who was a scholar on one hand, so he knew how to do the weights and measures and dot the I's and cross the T's, but he said that the most important information that he got and that he wanted to convey was to conjure the image of something before someone's mind and have them feel it.
Oh, that's immersive.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's it requires the most healing, because in order to feel it, you have to feel through whatever problems you have, in order to create that crystal clarity, you have to always be on healing yourself. Mm-hmm. And not in an obsessive way, but you have to have a process down where you can alchemize stress, basically. So you can immerse yourself in things without having the incorrect impressions. So that's why a lot of people will just stick to like clairvoyance or clairaudience and they won't be immersive, is because it allows you to just almost work outside of yourself a little bit. And so when you become immersive and you merge with something and you're genuinely doing that, you get a lot of information. Like you get downloads of information, which he probably extrapolates in those books, but the information has to be able to pass through you and your mind several different times without something coming up. So you can imagine how clear the mind has to be for that type of, we're not talking about finding a missing person. We're talking about information that is essentially in a different language that you're translating and you're bringing down. It's massive.
This would be, that's a great point, actually, because this would be a difference between, say, a mystic. I think what it is there's a mystic aspect and then there's a kind of psychic clairvoyant aspect. And maybe a mystic can partake of those, but really their job is a little bit different. Their job is to kind of go into the spiritual realm and get information.
Which is incredible, which is, it's amazing, when you see a great clairvoyant or a great clairaudient or a medium, but there are different levels of psychic ability. And when you get to the immersive side of it, where you're genuinely merging with something, with all that you are, you can get incredible information, but you have to be at a point within yourself where you can almost remove the personality consciously and be completely engrossed in it. It leaves a pattern, and then when you come back in, you translate it. It sounds strange, but you have to be able to be there but not there. And
fascinating.
And if you have a lot of stress in your life, you're not able to be clear enough to do that.
Absolutely. And it's amazing. I was thinking about Steiner and the most requests that he got, according to him, even with all of the knowledge and all the information that he had, the biggest requests he got were for lottery numbers. People came for lottery numbers over and over again, even back then.
Isn't that Casey too? Casey always got those.
Oh yeah.
Money, tell me what the stocks are. And
yes.
you have a psychic that can, go into the Akashic records and generate power in their body. And they're like, how can I make money today? We're missing the point.
Well, it's amazing too, because there are great stories with Casey where he was giving health readings for someone. He was in the psychic state, and at the end of the reading, the person given the reading would say, what's going to come in the seventh race at such and such horse track? And they would go bet on it. And Casey would have amazing headaches afterwards and couldn't figure out why. And in his little photo studio, one day, an unusual man showed up in a turban, and he was very exotic looking. And Casey's studio was at the time, was in Alabama. And he had gone from Kentucky to Alabama and then to Virginia Beach. And so this guy would have been really out of place. And the guy comes up to him and puts his hand over his hand and says, "You're with the wrong people." And then he leaves. And Casey goes out and says, "Did you see that guy? Where did he go? Who was he?" Nobody else saw this person. But this is very interesting, because those mystery schools trekking right along with him, making sure that his work stayed on the up and up.
How many more questions do we have time for?
Not many.
Okay. Johann Wolf wanted to know, are we going to get back into planetary seals at all?
You mean today?
Yeah. I guess
I do have the
answer.
Jupiter planetary seals. What I would recommend, actually, is that Gigi and I are going to do another Steiner planets episode. I don't think there's any question about that, because there's just so much material there. And also, New Jupiter is something I think we need to get a handle on. So in the middle of the chaos of this ridiculous political campaign and all these things, we're going to be going deep on New Jupiter. and bringing that forward. Miss Olivia.
Okay, so what's in our sky? Did Edgar Casey ever talk about Ahriman or anything about the eighth sphere?
Well, it's interesting because he didn't refer to it as Ahriman. He called it Belial. But the Belial force this is an interesting story, actually, because the Belial force in Atlantis is what takes over the two-eye stone, and it's like, oh, you're using it for interfacing with spiritual beings in outer spheres? Tell you what we can use it for. And they use it to basically nuke their neighbors. So the Belial group is the Ahrimanic faction, if you combine the Steiner and Casey information. What's interesting is the group that's called Emilius is all based around this Emilius who Casey said incarnated 200,000 BC in Atlantis and led these initiates there at the time. That's an incarnation of Jesus. So when we get into the Emilius story, again, you're finding Jesus in the heart of it early on. And very often, Casey would say, when he was reviewing the lives of Jesus, he would say, Emilius as Adam, as if they were the same thing. But Adam is Emilius. So that's something to consider. Little did we know. Miss Olivia, get 2 more questions.
Okay, I really want to fit this one in. Michael Gale Media. Why do each Gigi and Daniel use the word initiate? What is your idea of it?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, there's a fundamental structure behind initiate, which is the mystery schools have a tradition of these higher beings initiating, the likes of us to be up on their level. And so when we take that down over time, it is the mystery school initiates hold the knowledge by doing the work, and they're able to initiate others into the work. So in its most fundamental nature. How would you see it, Gigi?
I think though, it's just a great word to describe being brought into a spiritual process that is forgotten. It's just a very good word for that. And I view it as we are initiated into higher consciousness through challenges too. So we're always sort of initiating ourselves back into ourselves in a way, back into our higher selves. And there are beings that will communicate with you if you allow them in, higher beings to help you with this initiation process. And we all have access to these. We all have spirit guides and groups that are here to help us. And that would be a good way to describe that process of helping, is a process of being initiated back into yourself, back into a higher awareness that we kind of lost when we fell in density. And really what the mystery schools have done is they've just taken that and literalized it into tradition. They've carried that on from a long, long, long time ago, but it's a mirroring of an organic spiritual process.
Absolutely.
Can I add something to that?
Yeah.
Okay, so I hate this term, but I am a Reiki master.
Yeah.
And when what I realized is I know there probably are many who are listening, is that it's a contract or a covenant that is set up between you and invisible entities, and a tradition that where they, at least in this capacity, work on your energy body to open you up and adjust you, make certain adjustments and attunements so that you're more effective as a healer in the world. And I see that as one form of initiation. They call it a Reiki initiation. So.
Absolutely. It's fascinating to think about that. It always amazes me that people say, when I check with my spirit guides, and that's fascinating to me, because when you have access to your spirit guides and you acknowledge them, it is powerful. And that's something that you do very often in your work. Gigi, now you have this series in plain sight. It's on YouTube. I recommend it to everyone. It is powerful, ahead of its time. You deal with topics that, you were saying that you came out of a New Age thing, but they're pretty dark topics for a new age, Gigi.
They're very, very, very dark, I think. But are we really much use if we don't go head on into where we're needed?
Yes.
I mean, really, this is my thing, is that, you know, if we are light workers, if we are spiritual beings, and that means that we can contain a higher amount of light, or we have, you know, this kind of desire to do exalted things or be exalted in some way, then why wouldn't we go head on into what is hurting people and what's hurting the world? Why would we not want to temper ourselves with that? Why would wouldn't we want to go into that? And that's how I see that. And the reality is about dark topics is ignorance is darkness. To be ignorant of something and afraid of something, that's darkness. But to be educated about something is not. The issue isn't dark anymore. And a lot of these topics seem dark because we fear them and we're afraid of them because we don't understand them. And there's a different dynamic available to us right now if we educate ourselves on these processes. And the occult processes, like we were saying with CERN and other groups, have a huge effect on our consciousness, and we have to start occupying that consciousness. And in order to do so, we have to be educated. So that's my goal with In Plain Sight, is to discuss difficult topics. And at the end of every video, I feel like we're all just like, well, that wasn't that bad. You know, I feel like that's kind of like what it is. It's like, oh, well, that wasn't that, I get that, okay. And then that depotentiates a lot. But maybe it's not for everybody, but.
Oh, it's fantastic. It's very innovative. There's a funny trailer that you use for it too, where you watch things on the screen and little by little your expression changes into horror as you're looking at it.
That was true. That was like a genuine, that was authentically my process. Yeah.
Fantastic. Gigi, it's great to see you. Amazing. And I want to, as we end the episode here, just to get a snapshot of Steiner, anthroposophy, what he brought through, and its ramifications in the 21st century. In a minute or so, how do you see the work that Steiner brought through to us?
I think that it's actually going to be the seeds of the future, and I think that anthroposophy, and I think Steiner's work is going to find its place. And I think that if people give the work a chance, I think that they'll find that it answers questions that they're looking for, because that was, you know, my experience. Is I didn't think some books from like the 1900s, the early 1900s, would contain anything relevant. I thought that consciousness moved and that you just got to be present with it. I didn't realize the timeless aspect to mysticism. And I didn't realize there was a tradition, and I didn't realize how valuable that was. And in my opinion, I think that Steiner's voice does the best of that.
Oh, yeah.
And so I think that because of that, he'll come, and I think that people will realize that he's answering questions that people don't even realize they're asking yet. I think that's
amazing. Absolutely amazing. Everyone, you can go to gigiyoung.com to sign up for Gigi's courses. Those are intuitive courses, Gigi, and you're into the second course now. Yes,
so I have courses on my website as well. If you want to develop that intuition, you want to make that connection with your spirit, I do teach that. Everything from a beginner level to psychic protection, and even to a more advanced level. So, and we have forums that you can chat on there, and I do live Q&As. we have a thing going on over there. Yeah.
Fantastic. It's great work. I always hear fantastic things from people who are taking those courses. So absolutely amazing work. Of course, on YouTube, Gigi Young, amazing work and great videos, including this series In Plain Sight. Very edgy. Yes, Miss Olivia.
Okay, two things.
Yes.
So What books are good for someone just starting with Steiner? Knowledge of Higher Worlds is usually the one.
Knowledge
that
of
you
Higher
recommend?
Worlds.
Cosmic Memory.
Oh,
Cosmic Memory, yeah. You know, what's interesting is Knowledge of Higher Worlds is sort of like Steiner's hit single. It's the one that goes right down the middle and, you know, gives you the, and Cosmic Memory is my personal favorite. But what's interesting is that's more like the interesting album that he has. You know?
It totally is. You nailed it.
Tracks.
It's
Yes.
the experimental, like, yeah.
It's got it though. It really, and it is powerful. Absolutely.
I just wanted to ask you, so we had a few questions about Rudolf Steiner's death, his murder.
Oh, yes.
And would you be willing to go into that a little bit?
Yeah, what I think we can do, we're wrapping up this episode. What I will say is that Steiner, as we mentioned, was poisoned on New Year's Day in 1925 when he was at basically a anthroposophical event that this happened. And it's on the record, and I think the thing that Gigi had mentioned about it is important, which is that Steiner didn't want this to be his legacy as, oh, let's remember this, you know, person who led this movement and then was felled by these assassins through poison. But he understood it enough to discuss it with his wife. There are witnesses from the event about what happened. And there was a strange celebration in New York, of all places, among those kind of left-hand groups that this had taken place. So it's a pretty steady track record about it. Steiner made great use of the time that he had there. And there is a quote that we can end on in relation to this, if I can find it. But basically, it was Steiner's friend, the doctor, Ida Wegman, and she was with him through to the end of his life. And what she was trying to tell us, I have a shot of her actually, very inspired woman. And
Boy, those eyes.
I know, isn't she just powerful?
Incredible.
But what she was trying to tell us about Steiner at the end is that he had spent so much time in the spiritual realm that it had taken a toll on his physical body. And when he was poisoned, he used his astral body to keep his physical body alive, which would have perished shortly after he was poisoned, but he was able to keep it alive long enough to try to redress where anthroposophy and the society was going. He actually had reincorporated the society in this period. And he would die on March 30th, 1925 at the age of 64. Gigi, an incredible amount of work and prolific work in 64 years.
Just the things that he was able to achieve. And I feel like he knew, you know, he could sense a lot of things going on. I know that there's people who discuss and think, yes, he was, no, he wasn't. But I would just add that I think that Steiner, you know, in my opinion, was very cognizant of the energy of everybody, of the collective, of people. And I feel like even in his own death, he would want people to hold a certain energy, and he would want anthroposophy to have a certain life force. So I think that that's why there's confusion around it, is I believe that he wanted to keep the tradition in a certain condition, and that if there was all this drama around him, he understands that would distract from the work. And so I think that there's almost a sense of sacrifice with that. And a choice and a sacrifice with that. And that's how I see that.
Amazing, Gigi. Great observation. Fantastic work, Gigi. Thanks so much for coming on with us. And we'll talk soon.
Thank you for having me, and good night, everybody, and have a lovely evening.
Everyone, Gigi Young. A big round of applause. Unbelievable. Miss Olivia, do you have some super chatters?
We do. I need to thank them. So James Belch, Eurythmy is Fun, Josh Randall, Wayne Peak, Kim Woodrum, Charles Marlowe, Eric Ackerley, Doyle Wayne, Flood, and Ren de Blanc. I hope I pronounced that well.
Fantastic. It's great to see everyone out there, and just a fantastic crowd tonight. Very deep on Steiner and New Jupiter, and Gigi was taking us there, literally transporting us into this higher vision that Steiner had. Just incredible work that he put across, and her interpretation just fantastic. We will see you all next Friday, and I know that did you do your shout outs yet? You did them all.
We did them all.
Okay. It's great. I know you mentioned Josh Randall. It's great to see you out there. Aether, of course, fantastic. And cult fan, great questions tonight. Kate, Preston, Robert, it's great to see you. Cat I Am, Flood, Jason Turner, Pete Penn, Julian Lewis, fantastic questions in the ideas room tonight. And of course, we had a special ideas room graphic made up, and that was Olivia. Ideas Room Live QA, and there's nothing quite like it. And you do an incredible job of putting this together. So a nice round of applause for you, Miss Olivia. Just fantastic work. We will see everyone next week. And thank you so much for joining us. Steiner, New Jupiter, X Series 82. Of course, we always want to go deeper, but you'll be seeing more Steiner on the show very soon. And next week, a very powerful episode lined up for you.
Okay. Thanks, everybody. Stay safe and stock up on vitamin C.
That's a good idea. Well,
Make it liposomal if you can. They're running out.
And not even vitamin C and tequila, right? Just straight up.
Nope, we're on a health kick.
A health kick?
Yes.
Orange juice?
No. Orange juice isn't healthy. Too much sugar. No.
Orange juice isn't healthy?
No.
I don't know about that. We might have to take that up with Edgar Casey. Everyone, it's great to see you. Have a great night, and we'll see you next week.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks so much. Thank God the broadcast worked. But it's time to end the broadcast. But as you know, it never really ends. See you soon.